I would like to call the January 18th Committee of the Whole meeting to order and note that this meeting is a continuation of the Committee of the Whole meeting of January 11th, 2022. This meeting is taking place on unceded Algonquin territories, and I would like to thank the Algonquin nations for hosting this meeting on their land. And so since it's a continuation meeting, there's only 2 items on our agenda this evening. The 2 reports, report 22-007, approval of policy P147 GOW, and also report 22-004, specialized program class referral. And so at the time of the adjournment of the meeting of January 11th, 2022, there was a motion to approve the policy P147.gov as provided in report 22-007. And it was being discussed. 2 amendments were already tabled and carried. I would also like to note that staff have prepared a supplemental memorandum distributed earlier this evening, which outlines proposed revision recommended by staff. And so that's going to, at some point, require a motion to deal with that. And at the time we adjourned, I did have a speakers list, and we'll continue on with that speakers list since it's a continuation meeting. And so I have on my list that Trustee Lyra and Trustee Campbell had already spoken, but did wish to speak against her on the second time speakers list. Continuing on, I have Trustee Schwartz, Ms. Lamba, Ms. Miller, and Trustee Scott. And so those people are already on my list, as well as the second time speakers. So we'll continue on with that, and people who subsequently raise their hands will be added to that list. And so with that, just wondering before we get started, if that is clear to everyone. And Trustee Jenkins, did you have a question, or is that to get on the speaker list?
To get on the speakers list, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So it looks like it's cleared, everyone. So let's begin again with, Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did have a question, and that is with regard to the memorandum that was circulated to trustees late this afternoon. I don't know whether you've addressed that or how you wish to address that, where staff are proposing several revisions as well, which would have to be moved onto the floor by a board member.
Yes, of course. And I did mention that if someone, that has to be dealt with by a motion to amend. And so I'm hoping that one of the speakers will go ahead and do that and use part of their valuable 3 minutes of time, 3 minutes of fame to do so. So
thank you.
Thank you. And so with that, we'll move on to Trustee Schwartz. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I didn't have anything further from the previous meeting since I was moving a continuation motion forward. But since we do have some amendments to the proposed policy, I would like to move those amendments recommended by staff.
Thank you very much, Trustee Schwartz. And do you need introduction?
I do not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is there any debate on those amendments? Trustee Campbell?
Yes, thank you. It's more of a question than anything else. I personally am quite comfortable with the amendments, but I, in a sense, have a question, I guess, about their impact on with respect to the interpretation of the whole policy. So I don't know if I should go ahead with that, Mr. Chair, or how you want to deal with that.
Indeed, ask your questions, Trustee Campbell.
Okay, thank you. So this does, I think it's a great idea, but it does expand the scope somewhat of the policy, the scope of application of the policy. That's the intention. Beyond protected grounds, fundamentally. which is, or at least as I'm interpreting it, which suggests that we're going beyond human rights protected grounds, which may be fine, but I think we have to be clear about what we're doing here. And there are intersections then, if we're looking at scope, with respect to, which I'll bring up later when I get the floor again, but with respect to all other complaints procedures stopping permanently if the OHREA takes this on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there are implications potentially for a scope expansion, which may be fine, but I just like, I guess, a comment on that.
Madam Chair.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, so I think that one of the things that some of these amendments do the adjustments to the definitions that have been proposed here. What it does do is it speaks to the fact that it emphasizes the human part of human rights. And so the whole notion that nobody should be subjected to any of these infractions, regardless of a current protected ground, because again, it is a subjugation when you look at the totality of who people are. And so, even if you're not able to identify a particular protected ground, it doesn't mean that you should be subjected to any of these kinds of infractions. I will ask HREA Tanner to give a more technical response. And before she does that, she will take the liberty of introducing her or having her other team member introduce herself who was absent last time, and we want to make sure that she's included in the conversation tonight. So over to you, HREA Tanner, and for your introduction of your team member.
Thank you, Madam Director. And I'd just like to take a moment to invite Christina Saad to introduce herself. She wasn't able to join us last week, and Christina recently joined the Office of the Human Rights and Equity Advisor. Christina, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Camille. My name is Christina Saad. I have been in the role of the Human Rights Officer for about 2 months now. Prior to this, I was a student rights advocate at the University of Ottawa, and I have years of experience working in human rights law, both locally and internationally. I'm also fluent in Arabic and English. And I'd just like to thank you all for having us and taking the time to discuss this very important policy. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Christina. And I think just to sort of expand a little bit on what Director Williams-Taylor mentioned, the goal with the policy is to find a standard definition that we can use throughout the district. So for harassment, we're trying to use a standard definition that covers both code-based harassment and non-code-based harassment. But if you look deeper into the policy at 4.2, when you're looking under scope and application, it specifically limits the application of this policy to harassment that's based on protected grounds. So the goal was to really adjust the examples so that they could be used for both code-based and non-code-based discrimination, but then this policy will only apply to code-based.
Okay, great. So it's a common, I appreciate that. That really does help. So it's a common definitions across the policies, which are large in scope, but then there's a limiting clause within this policy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Campbell and Trustee Ellis.
So, yeah, I'm still not clear from that. So is it my understanding that the reference to protected ground is too limiting? Is this staff's position?
Through you, Chair. That's not the position. I guess to be a little bit more clear, Many different kinds of harassment are prohibited at the OCDSB. Harassment on protected grounds, but under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, for example, harassment on non-protected grounds is also prohibited at the OCDSB. So what we've done with the definition of harassment in the human rights policy, and one of the actions at the bottom of the LOT is to sort of standardize the definitions that are in this policy and apply them to other policies within the district as well, so that we have harmonization across policies. So the small revisions that we're proposing to the definition for harassment is simply to the examples that were used to describe types of harassment. So the definition of harassment refers to it being, sorry, let me just pull it up so I have the exact words in front of me, a course of vexatious comments or actions that are known or not reasonably known to be unwelcome. And then it can happen on code-based or non-code-based grounds. The examples give some examples of what harassment might look like, but we don't want to limit the examples just to code-based grounds, because in other policies, when this definition is applied, it won't work. So then what we do later in our policy at 4.2 is say, and in this policy, we're only looking at harassment on protected grounds, so code-based harassment.
So if we look at the first example, A, and when you remove the reference to protected ground, we're not giving any direction, joke, innuendos. There are jokes and innuendos that are harmless. We're having no standard. I see this as complicating, that makes example A a rather meaningless example. What kind of joke? Any joke? So I'm, I think, for the example, anyways, it's not a deal breaker for me. I mean, we still have protected ground in the definition for harassment, as well as non-code based harassment. You could have examples that for those that fall under the protected ground, and then some examples that fall under other issues. I'm not sure you reference, well, let me go this way. You reference that we're to keep, this is to be in alignment with other policies. How with taking that out, can you give me an example of some of the alignment that we're looking to achieve in our all other policies that need this to be changed?
I'm happy to, through you, Mr. Chair. So I think, Trustee Ellis, one thing to keep in mind is the examples are examples, but the test is in the definition at the top. So it would have to be an epithet, a remark, or a joke, or an innuendo that was known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. So that's the real test for harassment. It's not about the example. It's about an action that is known or ought reasonably be known to be unwelcome. So a specific example of jokes or innuendos that would be not on protected grounds might be teasing someone all the time about being fat. It's not a protected ground, but it's not something that you're allowed to do if it's known or ought reasonably be known to be unwelcome. Teasing someone about another aspect, having red hair. Something that it could be known or ought reasonably be known to be unwelcome. So it's about taking a personal characteristic or physical attribute and engaging in that kind of behavior. But the test is up in the known or ought reasonably be known to be unwelcome.
I think we all have an understanding of what is meant by ought to be known and reasonable, but we have plenty of examples in the world where that doesn't seem to resonate the same with all people. Again, my concern, I understand the issue around the protected grounds, and I'm not disputing that that wording isn't that great, But I'm also concerned that at least with protected ground, we had something we could point to and say, here's a definition of what it is. Will there be more robust examples of jokes that, you mentioned as, using weight as a negative descriptor of someone would fall under this. But, there's a wide range. We're again, my concern here is that we're again leaving this up to the discretion of our education workers, principals, and we're not giving them a whole lot of, we're throwing it back onto their understanding of it. I'm just wondering, as we go out to build capacity, so that our educational workers understand the nuances of this, how these examples are going to give them that robust understanding.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I guess Superintendent McCoy may be able to address this a little bit with more detail than me, but we have obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which covers discrimination on non-code-based grounds, as well as discrimination on code-based grounds. It prohibits discrimination in the workplace. Prohibits harassment in the workplace. I misspoke. And we have obligations under that to engage in some sort of professional development with our staff on a regular basis. So I'll pass it over to Superintendent McCoy to perhaps expand on that a little bit more.
Thank you. Yes, as HREA Tanner indicated, so we have additional obligations with respect to harassment under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in terms of our obligations to maintain a healthy workplace for our employees, and the harassment under that act is not limited to harassment on the basis of the protected grounds in the Human Rights Code. So if we were to adopt the same definition of harassment that was originally in the policy for purposes of our respectful workplace policy, which addresses non-code-based harassment, the examples that are provided would indicate that only where the jokes or the comments are related to a protected ground, it would seem to suggest that only where they are related to a protected ground could they form the basis for a finding of harassment in the course of a complaint that came forward. And so I think it's really about trying to ensure that if we are going to come up with definitions through this policy that we're going to apply to other policies, we need to ensure that when we look at them in that context, that they are achieving the result that's intended by the policy and meeting the obligations that we have under the Human Rights Code. So I think in terms of the concern, and I think it was Trustee Ellis who specifically asked about the training that's provided, and I think as part of the training and capacity building that will happen as a result of this policy, the examples that would be provided would be based around the protected grounds, whereas if we are talking to our staff around the respectful workplace piece, we would use examples that would be, as the definition indicates, unwelcome, known to be or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome, which may be unrelated to protected grounds, but nonetheless fall within the definition of harassment as set out here. So I'm not sure if that makes it any clearer, but just again, to put it in a different context where we will be needing to use the same definition.
Well, my question wasn't answered. My question, or what I was trying to get to, is we have protected grounds and we know what they are. And then we have this more nebulous non-code based. I'm just trying, and I don't see much of a reference beyond these few examples of what that could be in this policy. I'm just wondering if there will be a more expansive list. And sorry, and I'm done. I know I've gone over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it looks like there are no more speakers to this, unless there's a further information from either Superintendent McCoy or Ms. Tanner. No? Yes? Okay. I see Ms. Lamba has her hand up. So do you have a question, Ms. Lamba? You're muted, Ms. Lamba.
Sorry. I was just going to ask in 2.14, you do mention indeed personal. So non-code harassment, you just mean personal harassment, right? Like that's how I understand it. There's human rights related harassment and then what we call personal harassment. And that's just, okay, it's not based on any, human rights characteristics or anything like that. It's just somebody is harassing a particular person because of who they are, not code-based, it's just personal. Somebody doesn't like someone else and they harass them or they humiliate them or whatnot, just because of that person. Is that correct? Is that how you understand it?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's a fair summary. Thank you, Ms. Lamba.
Okay, thank you very much. And seeing no further speakers, I'd like to go back to Trustee Schwartz for a wrap up on the amendment.
I think this clarifies the intent. I'm happy with these recommended amendments to the policy, and with that, I hope other trustees will support these additions or these changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, call a question on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment?
Campbell in favor.
Scott in favor.
Ellis in favor.
Blackburn in favor.
Boothby in favor.
Schwartz in favor.
Huff in favor.
Jennings in favor.
Any in favor? And opposed?
Bell in favor.
Thank you very much. And that passes. And so that amendment is adopted. Thank you very much. And Trustee Schwartz, you probably had just a little bit more.
I'm good. I can pass it along to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Schwartz. And our next speaker is Ms. Lamba on the main motion.
Okay, I have a few questions that I don't think are substantive. And then I have a few that I think are. So the non-substantive one is just in the definitions. I didn't see a definition of intersectionality. I do see it in 3.9. To me, that's not a definition. That's about the impact of intersectionality. I think it'd be useful to have a definition of intersectionality in it. And you can base the definition on the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who has a paper on intersectionality. Is that possible?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm supportive of including a definition of intersectionality. I think it's a concept that not everyone is familiar with, but it's a very important one in terms of assessing impact. So I am supportive of that if that was a motion that was going to be put forward.
Okay. And then another point that's just, it's not substantive, it's just more consistent with other board policies, is in 3.5 and 3.6, whether we could, after the word equally or equality, add in 3.58, be treated equally and equitable. And then in 3.6, where the sentence in the second line says principles of equality and equity. Could we add the word equity after the word equality just to make it consistent with other board policies?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't have any objections to that from a human rights perspective. I read equity into the process of achieving substantive equality from my framework, but I know from other people's frameworks, sometimes it's good to actually specifically reference equitable. So I am supportive of that approach if trustees felt like that might add clarity. I don't think it's absolutely necessary because I think it can be read into equality, but it could add value.
I would note, Ms. Lamba, that it requires a trustee to actually make an amendment. So we're taking your points as suggestions. Should a trustee in the future wish to move those amendments? Okay.
Okay, and then I have just two more points, and they're a bit more substantive. In 2.2, peoples in positions of authority is defined, and it appears to include educators, right? And the last part, and any employee while they're working directly with students. But I feel that's not consistent with 4.11, 4.12, and 4.13, whereas 4.11 is people in positions of authority. And then 4.12 is, in addition to the obligations of people in positions of authority, principals and vice principals have these additional obligations. But then in 4.13, it says educators. So for the first time, we see the educators have the following obligations, almost as if they're not included in the people in positions of authority. Was that the intent?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the intent was that educators are included as people in positions of authority when they are interacting with students or interacting in a way where they are a person in position of authority. So an educator vis-a-vis their colleague might not be a person in position of authority, but vis-a-vis relational to a student, they would be. So the intention was that educators would also have the responsibility of people in positions of authority under 4.11 when they're in a particular relational position with students. Thanks.
You can see why I don't think the 4.13, because it doesn't have, in addition to the obligations of people in authority, but 4.12 does, and it's specifically for vice principals, so it could show that it may not apply. So that was just my point on that. That 4.13 should have something in addition to, something like, in addition to the obligations of people in positions of authority, educators have the following obligations. And I have one last substantive point, and I might have to get back on the list because I may not finish it in my 30 seconds. And that is just around the issue around accountability. In the last part, 4.44 or 4.45 around accountability, I feel like it's important to have the concept of reporting that educators and vice principals and superintendents have a duty to report. And I feel that's a what and not a how. What do they need to do? They need to report or have a mechanism to report. How they do it can be in the procedures. Do you have any thoughts about that? And I might need to be added again, sorry.
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's an interesting point, and it's one that I've considered. I think it's very important to have transparency and accountability. And I think information about what's going on the ground in terms of human rights related cases is informative in terms of making strategic shifts to avoid systemic discrimination and to evaluate how well we're doing at responding so we can get better. I have looked at policies from other districts, and that obligation isn't typically built into the policy, but I have seen it built in a limited way into some procedures. So for example, TDSB, I couldn't find in the policy any specific obligation of a person handling a human rights case to report it anywhere other than to deal with it. However, when you get to a procedure, there is a specific procedure that talks about reporting into a centralized system, online system, incidents of racism, hate, and bias. And they have to be reported by Ps and VPs within 24 hours. So I guess what I'm saying is there is an obligation built in for the HREA's office to publicly report on incidents that the HREA's office handles. That's in 4.14. 4.14D. There's also an obligation on the district in the transparency and accountability section that you spoke about, Ms. Lamba, to report publicly sort of on disparities. But you're right, there isn't specifically an obligation for people outside of the HREA's office who are handling human rights concerns to mandatorily report them into a centralized system. So speaking quite openly, concerns I would have about incorporating that into a policy is we're not really sure how big that work is yet. For example, all the work of learning support services more or less deals with providing accommodations to children with special education needs. At what point and what situations are we reporting? A teacher in a classroom might handle something quickly. Does that get reported? So I worry if we put something in a policy but can't actually have the mechanism in place immediately to deal with it, that it becomes an empty and unfulfilled promise. Whereas if we use procedure to sort of guide when we have a complaint, how are we going to deal with it? We're going to deal with it this way, we're going to have reporting this way, and we're going to do this. I feel like it gives us the opportunity to have a more nuanced approach and sort of develop our approach as we go and build trust that way. So I guess I feel like transparency and accountability is highlighted in the policy as it stands. I think that there is an important public reporting function that's coming out of the office of the HREA through the director. I think that will give us insight into what's going on, and that my recommendation is we're starting at 0 with one person office that recently expanded to 3. But I'm just wary of committing to more than we might be able to handle right off the bat. So I'm not sure if such a broad concept that we haven't been able to investigate all the ins and outs of can really go into policy just yet. Although I agree in principle with the idea and think that it might be more strategic to start with building that into procedure. So those are my thoughts around that at the moment.
Ms. Lamba, I've put you on the second time speakers list, if that's okay. And okay, thank you. And moving on, our next is Ms. Miller. Go ahead, Ms. Miller.
Hi, thanks. I have 3 points / questions. The one thing I was wondering about is under resource implications. We say the financial costs of providing mandatory training to all staff. I think it's just as important to recognize that there's going to be financial cost to provide education to students and parents so that they know their rights. Is there anything in the policy that talks about that?
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much for the comment. I agree, like we can promise to do a lot of things, but if they're not resourced well, it doesn't really help us get there. So there is an obligation built into the policy for, I'm just going to look it up. I think it's under responsibilities of principals. I just need to find out which. Okay, so 4.12A talks about obligations of principals and vice principals. And what it says is that principals and vice principals have these additional obligations. And A is providing students and families with annual information about their rights and obligations. and the processes for requesting an accommodation and reporting a complaint of discrimination or harassment. They also have the responsibility to provide information to all school-based staff on human rights and their obligations under the policy and procedures. So the obligation to make sure information is being proactively shared annually so that students at the start of the year really sort of are made aware, and so are their families, is built in. But it's not specifically enumerated in the financial implications piece.
Okay, so that would be one time per year is what we're saying there. Okay, I mean that if someone is not familiar with human rights and the ins and outs of that, my suggestion is might not be enough. Okay, so just a comment there. My other comment was about the word dignity, and dignity is really, like, I see it as a cornerstone kind of word in this human rights policy and in other human rights policies. And I don't see it in the definitions, and I think it's really important. I wonder what you think about that.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. So I just want to tie up a loose end on the previous question, and then I'll slip into that question. I think another way to frame the thing around human rights is that when you break down the right to education, which is done at the start of this policy, the right to education actually includes the right to learn about human rights and the rights of others. And what we've done with 4.13 is also put the obligation onto educators. Like, it really should be incorporated into the classroom. It's not meant to be, as you pointed out, a one and done. So a principal and a vice principal. I think that's more education about process, right? The principal and vice principal are intended to give out enough information so people can recognize if they have a rights issue and know where to go for help. But really, educators have an obligation professionally within their classrooms to really be building in this teaching into their daily practices, teaching about human rights, teaching about individual rights and the rights of others, teaching about Indigenous rights, teaching about rights so that we learn how to not only enforce our own rights, but how to live peacefully and respect the rights of other people and the rights of other people to have opinions that are different than our own. So while we could be looking at external resourcing for this, I think really the way the resourcing needs to be done is through sort of developing the professional capacity of the people who we already have interacting with children in the classrooms, interacting with parents, interacting with staff through our professional development to really kind of reinforce that knowledge and increase the ability to really kind of streamline that into classroom practices. And dignity, look, it's foundational. It's the cornerstone of human rights. You said it. So should it be defined? Possibly. I'm not aware of whether or not the OHRC has the definition of dignity off the top of my head. But if you felt like it was an important thing and trustees agreed that it was an important concept to define, I'm not opposed to that. I'm sometimes cautious about defining everything because I sometimes worry that a definition can limit a nuanced interpretation and can sometimes have the opposite effect of what we're hoping it would have. But I do agree that it's a foundational and fundamental term and should be at the center of what we're doing.
Okay. And my final thought was that in 4.13, ensuring that the classrooms and the educational materials are intentionally inclusive. I just wonder about the word "the." I know it's picky, but like, if a teacher has one inclusive book, is that enough? Like, it just seems like, I don't know, maybe there's something else that will be added to this to ensure that it really does have teeth. But when I read this, I don't really see how, on the other hand, like I don't know if it can be, how you would enforce that. I'm not sure. It's just that I guess I don't know if the educational materials, most educational materials, I'm not sure. Like if you don't give an amount, does it matter?
That's, through you, Mr. Chair, that's a difficult question. Not every one piece of material is going to be inclusive of all people, right? So I think what we're looking for is sort of representation across materials of a multiplicity of identities and intersectional identities. In my view, erasure and the failure to have representation in the classroom is discrimination, because children have the right to an education that is inclusive and teaches them about diversity in other cultures, so cultures that are different than their own. So when we get to enforceability, would it be possible that someone could raise a concern under this policy that all of the materials in their one particular class were Eurocentric and didn't represent a multiplicity of views? And could that lead to findings? I think it probably could. What's the solution? The solution would then be to work with that teacher and direct them for what they would need to do to increase representation within the materials. So I think it does create a window for enforceability. I don't know if quantifying the or all or 50%, I'm not sure if that gets us to where we need to be, or if just having this here sort of opens the door and then we just work with that as a leveraging point to really kind of have policy behind our mantra, which is we want to have inclusion in the classrooms, but this sort of gives it a bit more teeth. And it also reinforces, I think, our, now I'm going to get the name wrong, but we have an inclusive education policy, which I think this enforces.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, if I might just add a little bit to that response, and thank you, Ms. Miller, for your question there, is that indeed it does go to the intersection of supervision of instruction and the responsibility for that. So it goes to a number of intersections. HREA Tanner has made reference to one of our policies around instructional practice, but we also have a variety of other responsibilities for accountability that go to, for example, supervision of practice in a classroom. So there is the appraisal process that works for all of us in education, where we do have responsibilities there. And so when you have enshrined in policy the expectation that says that we should be, there's an expectation that we see representation in the classroom in this way, that we have pedagogical expectations for teaching practice, that it does allow then for those in roles, positions of supervision, to be able to proactively expect, supervise, and resource. But it also gives a foundation for students themselves, other educators, people in the classroom, community members, to ask for what has been promised, because that has been enshrined in practice or in policy. So it's a very small and simple line, but it actually lends itself to a very powerful foundation for delivery, just in the scope that it provides.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Is there we're all good? Good, thank you. And I guess we're moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and huge appreciation for this policy. It is complex. It covers a lot of issues where we have difficulty saying it straight without repeating ourselves and without tangling ourselves in many philosophical pathways and legal language pathways. I think that overall, staff have done quite an amazing job of getting this together into one piece that makes sense. It is going to be difficult for some people to read and follow, and that does concern me somewhat, but I'm hopeful that in our practice and in our communications about the policy, we can help to ease some of the challenges that some of our school community members, staff, students, and their families might face in trying to just parse everything that is in this policy as it's written. In terms of the format, I do have one basic concern, and that is the use of capitalization. I probably read too many 18th century documents where capitals were used ad lib to emphasize all kinds of things. It took me a while, but I eventually figured out, and I think I'm right, that the use of capitals for things is basically attached to whether or not things have been included in the list of definitions. And this becomes very confusing when you see those defined items included in lists with other items that have not been defined. For example, bullying is not defined. It shows up without a capital in lists in parts of the policy, while the things before it and after it do have capitals. And I think we probably should find another way to identify the things that are defined rather than just capitalizing them, because it makes it harder to read. And I wonder if staff could comment on that.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I'll go to actually ask Executive Officer Giroux to respond to the question. You did raise this in a previous reading, Trustee Scott, and I believe this goes to an OCDSB convention. So I'm going to go to Executive Officer Giroux on that one because it's not just about the human rights policy. It speaks to some of our policy writing in general. So over to you, Executive Officer.
Thanks very much. So I think HREA Tanner mentioned earlier the challenge of definitions. You definitely see an increased use of definitions in our policies. And the reason for that is to bring some consistency to interpretation and understanding. And so we have made a shift in style to and it's not a complete shift because we did use it in some cases in the past, but not necessarily in all cases. So we have made a shift to capitalizing words that are defined so that the reader is cued to know that there is a definition and not to have a general interpretation of that term. It's not an uncommon practice either in the policy world or in legal drafting. But is a style piece that we thought might be helpful here. I do appreciate the comments about the use or abuse of capital letters. I share those concerns in a more general context, but think that for defined terms, it does have a place in these policies.
I would add that I understand the rationale. I just think that there could be perhaps a better mechanism that would be less disruptive to the reader. For example, if those were left as lowercase and simply put in bold with a note at the beginning of the policy saying that all of the defined terms would be in bold throughout. But I will leave that to staff's discretion. The second thing I wanted to go to was one of the suggestions that Ms. Lamba made, and that is in terms of including a definition for intersectionality. And I would like to move to amend the policy to include a definition for intersectionality. I do not have one to offer at the moment, but I would assume that staff could provide one and incorporate it, and we would have a chance to look at it again at board.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Trustee Scott. My team has been sending me, while you've been speaking, some OHRC definitions of intersectionality and dignity. The interesting thing about the OHRC is they sometimes have multiple definitions of one term. So with your indulgence, I would like the opportunity to take that back and propose something that we think might work best with this policy based on an OHRC definition.
Thank you. I appreciate that and fully understand. But I guess my proposed amendment is that a definition for intersectionality be added to the policy. And that, I think, is something we could determine tonight, even though we don't have the specific language for the definition. The important thing is that there should be a definition.
All right, so you're proposing amendment, Trustee Scott, of, and I think your exact words were that a definition for intersectionality be added to the policy?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have an introduction for that amendment?
I don't think any introduction is necessary.
Thank you.
And I hope that people would see it as potentially friendly.
Yes. And if that is not friendly, please raise your hand or speak out rather.
I would like to sub-amend if possible to include "and dignity."
All right, so Trustee Bell proposes to sub-amend the words "and dignity" to that. And so if this is not friendly, please raise your, or sorry. You have an introduction to that sub-amendment, Trustee Bell?
As I have shared in the chat, the definition for dignity that I found on the Ontario Human Rights Commission's webpage really gives a good sense to why, as a cornerstone of a human rights policy, this is important. And I think it goes so far as to provide the type of backing and information that everyone, despite their level of education, could really understand and resonate with. And therefore, I would like to propose what Lily Miller, our representative on the Indigenous Advisory Council, has brought forth as a positive change to this policy. I'd like to bring that forth in addition to the definition that Chair Scott has brought forth.
Thank you very much. And is there any discussion on the sub-amendment where on this Trustee Bell sub-amendment? Trustee Ellis?
I'm just looking for clarification on the intent. We're looking at 2 additional definitions, or are we trying to put both of them into one definition?
I believe that Trustee Bell just put forward a motion to add additional definition for dignity, but if that's not correct, please correct me, Trustee Bell.
That is correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure staff understand we're expecting 2 definitions, not one incorporating both items.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Trustee Ellis. And so any further discussion on the sub-amendment? And seeing none, do you want wrap up for your sub-amendment, Trustee Bell?
No, thank you, Chair.
Okay, and it's just the same if I ask if it's friendly or ask for the to call the question. So I'm just going to call the question on that. All those in favor of Trustee Bell's sub-amendment of adding and dignity? And just
Scott in favor.
Excuse me, Chair. Again, you've called the question. Okay.
yeah, just call the question.
Bell in favor?
Huff in favor. Lyra in favor.
Schwartz in favor.
Ellis in favor.
Blackburn in favor.
Jennings in favor.
Campbell in favor.
Any in favor? Thank you, and that passes. And then we're now back, sorry, any opposed? And now we're back to, that amendment passes. Now we're back to Trustee Scott's original amendment of including intersectionality and now the definition of intersectionality and now dignity in there. Any further debate? And Trustee Bell?
No further debate on this. My hand was residual.
Thank you. And Trustee Booth?
Sorry, same thing, dangling hand.
No problem. Trustee Campbell?
A bit of a pattern, sorry.
No problem. It is getting a little bit twisted. I'm sorry. We have a number of amendments and sub-amendments, and trying to keep it clear is tough for me. And I've got it all written down on paper, but I think that it closes our speakers list for the amendment, and we're back to Trustee Scott for a wrap up on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I had no difficulty with the sub amendment that I would have. My plan was that was the next thing I was going to ask for, was a definition to be added for dignity. If we put them both in one amendment, that means we don't have to have quite such a complicated vote. So I just hope that everyone will support this and look forward to seeing what staff bring forward for definitions at board when they've had a chance to review existing accepted definitions.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to call a question on that. All those in favor, just speak out.
Lyra in favor.
Boothby in favor.
Campbell in favor.
Huff in favor. Blackburn in favor.
Schwartz in
Scott
favor.
in favor.
Bell in favor.
Jennings in favor.
Ellis in favor.
Any in favor? And all opposed? And that passes. Thank you very much, everyone. And going back to Trustee Scott, I think you have still a little bit of time.
I'm out of time, I think.
All right. Did you want to go back on the list, Trustee Scott?
I'll decide later. Thank you.
No problem. We're moving on then on the main motion to Trustee Jennings.
Thank you, Chair Keith. And I'm certainly mindful of the direction the conversation is going this evening, where we are concerned of over defining things or over legalizing things. But my question is in the first section under objectives A through E, section D, remedying harm. I'm wondering if we need clarification or clarity of what harm we're referring to. From my perspective, it could be 3 separate areas. Harm by default, perhaps it's someone who's known to cause harm to themselves or to others. Could it be harm by omission? Perhaps a bystander watching and not helping someone who's being harmed. Could it be harm by accident? So if I could get clarification on whether or not we need a definition for harm.
Thank you, Trustee Jennings, through you, Mr. Chair. So human rights legislation is intended to be remedial. And when we say remedial, it's really about putting the person back into the place they would have been in if they hadn't have encountered the discrimination. So when we're talking about remedying harm, addressing the impacts of the discrimination would be one piece of the harm that would be addressed. And then when we're building in a restorative approach, it's not just about the harm to the person, but it's also about the harm to the relationship. So if we're looking at a restorative approach, it's really about trying to work together to look for paths forward to repair the relationship. And that's not something you can force, right? There needs to be agreement between parties involved about whether or not they are willing to engage in that process. But the remedying of the harm, I guess, is the harm caused by discrimination or a violation of the policy to the person, as well as the harm caused to the relationship, in my view. It may be that the director or someone else may prefer to add something to that, but that's the perspective I've been taking on it.
Okay, thank you. That was my only question, actually.
Thank you very much. And we're moving on. I note that I did have Trustee Bell's hand up at some point. Trustee Bell, did you have a question on the main motion?
Hi, apologies here. Yes, I do. Thank you, and through you, Chair. Very much appreciate this policy. I find it incredibly thorough and well written. And I guess my first question relates to some of the points we've heard already tonight. And how will a teacher know when they have witnessed, or an educator know when they have witnessed a human rights violation? And I understand that there will be training involved. But I also wonder if it also has to do with culture and creating a culture where they feel compelled to recognize and to report on potential human rights violation that they may witness. If you could speak to that, Ms. Tanner, that would be fabulous.
Thank you, Trustee Bell, and through you, Mr. Chair. Well, that's a good question, right? There's certainly professional development that people need to take responsibility for themselves. The role of being in a position of, so if you are teaching about human rights, you need to be able to really understand. And that's also like reinforced in the Education Act, right? So diversity, inclusion, and I understand that my internet is dropping out. So
Yes, Miss Tanner, we're having
go off video for a second to
a lot of
improve
distortion there,
reception.
sorry.
But those are real that we, again, now that being said, no one is opportunities for professional development. That winter storm, I'm still reaping the benefits, I think, with all the snow on my roof. Can folks hear me okay now? I've just switched internet service providers. Is that better?
Much better, Ms. Tanner.
Okay, thank you. Chair, and please let me know if that happens again. So I guess what we're looking at is a combination. A teacher needs to take it on themselves as part of their professional responsibility to learn about human rights, to learn about their professional obligations, and to learn what their obligations are. Equally, we've put a responsibility on principals and vice principals at the start of each year to share information with their employees about rights and obligations. So I'm hoping through that annual kind of refresher, people are going to be reminded. And then our office will be working on developing accompanying sort of outreach materials. It's been said this policy is complicated. It is. And it's complicated for people who love human rights and really want to dig into it and understand it. And for some people, like, human rights aren't their focus. They're willing to learn, but it's not really like their passion and their love, right? So for folks like that, we will be developing sort of simplified materials that really kind of basically outline what are your rights, what are your obligations, how do you do it, where do you go to find out more? And I think through those kinds of simple materials and having sort of commitment to what's internal to this policy sort of flowing down from the senior team down, we will go towards building that culture of human rights that everyone is committed to and that people can speak to. So when we go about identifying when you see or witness a situation of discrimination, it is an obligation of any employee who witnesses discrimination against a child or a student in our school to report it to the principal or vice principal. So we will need to ensure that people have sufficient information to, at a very minimum, be able to recognize and report. And that will be through professional development.
Oh, wow. That last part was incredibly helpful, because I have to say I didn't see within the policy a duty to report on a human rights violation. And so I guess that's my question, because I had thought to include on 4.45 at the end of the text specific language which says who will report each human rights violation incident promptly to your office. And so if that is already captured within the policy, I wouldn't need to include that. So can you just clarify, please, Human Rights Advisor Tanner?
I'm happy to, Trustee Bell, through you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to find the exact place so that I can refer you directly there.
Meanwhile, Sandra, I think your mic's on, or Trustee Schwartz, FYI.
Thank you. You can hear me sneezing clearly. Sorry.
So Trustee Bell, in 4.7, we talk about obligations of all OCDSB community members. And when we're talking about community members, that's everyone. That's the people sitting around this table, that's educators, it's students, it's parents. And then if we get down to 4.7E, there is an obligation to report any violations of this policy that they become aware of if they feel safe to do so. A lot of people have raised concerns about reprisals. However, all employees are required to immediately report to the principal or vice principal or the office of the HREA upon becoming aware of any violation that affects a student. So what we're really trying to build in here is recognition of our obligation to protect the children who are in our care. And if there's a human rights violation that's impacting on them, employees have a positive obligation to report it to people who can take action to address it.
A follow-up question to that. Let's say, for example, in a high school, there are situations that we would deem as human rights violations, and they have been reported to the principal, and the principal feels as if they have been dealt with. What would then be the principal's responsibility to report to your office that in fact a human rights violation has taken place within the school?
Through you, Mr. Chair, currently there's no responsibility. So the avenue is always open under the human rights policy for the person who experienced the human rights violation or someone who witnessed it or a parent to then bring it over to the office of the HREA. But what we need to remember is that we have approximately 74,000 students and approximately 170 odd schools. And we have, what we want to do is build expertise across the board, not just have it sitting within the Office of the Human Rights and Equity Advisor. So cases and incidents of human rights violations that can be handled by other mechanisms and that can be competently handled by them should be. So if a principal addresses a human rights violation within the school, that's great. We're happy to have that done. And if people aren't satisfied with the response, they're welcome to then escalate it and bring it over to our office if they are looking for a different set of eyes on it. So that's how the current policy is currently set up. Director Williams-Taylor, would you like to add anything?
Thanks, HREA Tanner. I think that you've rightly captured it, and what I was writing down here was you made reference to what I thought was a very powerful statement, which is a part of the goal of this policy, is actually to create a culture. So going back to our culture statements from our strategic plans, which speak to the culture of social responsibility, that this is actually a structure that advances that, but you speak to the culture of human rights. And so it's really important that we tread the line of accountability carefully, where we're talking about a culture which is pervasive as opposed to a compliance and punitive environment, which does not, the two are counterintuitive. So a compliance culture and a punitive culture actually is counter to a culture where you are actually building a commitment to enhancing and advancing human rights. So it's, it is a fine line there, but I think that when we're talking about the fact that we have a duty to be observant, a duty to understand, and a duty to respond and report, and we keep it as close to where it is that the infraction has occurred and we're able to resolve it, that I think that adding layers of measures after that impedes the development of a positive culture around human rights.
I don't see how much time I have on the clock through you, Chair, just to continue this conversation. I think that this is a very important point to raise. So I would like to put the motion on the table to hear from my fellow trustees on their thoughts on whether or not it should be written that should a human rights violation occur in school, that the office be notified of that and what was done to resolve it. And so with that, I have specific wording from which I'd like to bring the motion onto the table to discuss.
All right, so you're putting an amendment to the policy forward, Trustee Bell?
That is correct.
And you have the wording in the comments?
I was trying to get the wording, but I'm working from my cell phone tonight, so I'd like to read it out. Adding to the end of 4.45, the words, and who will report each human rights incident promptly to the Office of the Human Rights, and the proper wording for that office, the title of that office.
Excuse me, what clause are we looking at?
4.45.
I was wondering if you could just get this on screen so that people can be very clear about what they're seeing and voting for. And that goes at the end of 4.45, Nicole, if that is possible at all.
Through you, Chair, just for clarity, I actually thought that was 4.7E, the reporting of violations. 4.45, it was an inconsistency item. Perhaps I've misunderstood, but I thought we were discussing the obligations, and in 4.7E was the reporting of violations as that they became aware of.
I agree, Madam Director, but that was the wording of Trustee Bell's amendment.
Okay.
Point of clarification, if it is better placed in that section, I'm sorry, I'm working for very limited technology this evening to be looking back and forth.
And so, Trustee Bell, just to be clear, where is this sentence going to go?
I'm going to have to take the education director's word for where it would make most sense, because unfortunately I'm not able to get the document open on my limited technology this evening. If it is in fact better placed in the reporting and accountability section, which was my intention, the number of that clause would have to be reflected as per what the education director has just articulated.
Through you, Chair, if you like, I could just read it out, and Trustee Bell can, just for Trustee Bell's comfort, to make sure that it is in fact what her intention is. So 4.7E reads, reporting any violations of this policy, Appendix A, that they become aware of if they feel safe to do so, period. All employees are required to immediately report to the principal or vice principal or the office of the HREA upon becoming aware of any violation that affects a student, period. So I'm presuming that your interest in adding a component refers to that reporting piece.
Yeah, and that report would then be shared with the Human Rights Office.
Okay.
Promptly.
Okay, so the sentence that after the last sentence, instead of the period, it is "and who will report each human rights incident promptly to the Office of Human Rights," to the Office of the Human Rights Office.
Correct. I would say semicolon would be fine.
Would you
Mr. Chair, I guess I'm wondering whether the trustee might consider looking at the wording and maybe coming back on later. I mean, the Office of the HREA is mentioned now twice in that sentence, and I'm just wondering if there are other options with respect to the wording.
Would you consider that, Trustee Bell, of making your amendment at the point of the board meeting? Would you have access to better technology and much clearer?
Unfortunately, I'm not going to have access to better technology this evening. So if we could kindly add it onto the subsection that the director has indicated would be the most appropriate for this. And I think if you put a semicolon and who will report each human rights instance promptly to the Office of the Human Rights Office would be acceptable.
Okay. And so that is a semicolon at the end of the 4.7E, and then this this clause that is moved by Trustee Bell. So Trustee Bell, that is also your introduction, or do you have an additional word?
The reason, yeah, I do have an introduction. I know from my work in the public service when we were mandated to undertake a gender-based analysis plus assessment, that was really the means through which that it became culture, that people learned the language that was associated with gender equality. And so in that vein, what I am requesting here is that when an incident occurs and it is brought to the attention of a educator or the principal or any senior official within the board, that they will then do their due diligence to write up how it has been addressed, and that will be shared with the Human Rights Office. This is the type of data I believe that we are looking for, and it will be the means through which we can start to understand how in fact, below a principal level, human rights violations are being addressed. I understand what the education director has said about walking a fine line between creating a culture and ultimately making it bureaucratic. But in this instance, if we really want people to understand the language, I would definitely want to ensure that there is a means and a mechanism for them to write what has happened, and for the Human Rights Office to be able to collect that information. And if they feel safe enough to bring that forth, I hope that we would be able to, within the procedures, come up with a way to share that information in a sensitive fashion. That's it for my introduction.
Thank you very much. And on the original speakers list, I did have Trustee Ellis and Trustee Blackburn, but I do have a list before me right now of hands up, and we're going to go with.
My hand is up to speak to this amendment.
Okay, go ahead, Trustee
Blackburn. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like a staff comment about this, because if I'm understanding the mover's intention, would it be, first of all, I'd like a staff comment in general if this is, if they feel, and if possible from the Director of Education, if she feels this is a prudent way to go. My other concern is, so are we, is the expectation that teachers would be writing up these things? Would EAs be writing up these things? Would office administrators be writing up these things? Would custodians be writing up these things? Would librarians be writing up these things? I'm quite concerned about this amendment.
Thank you, through you, Chair, and to the questioner. It is, I think, Trustee Blackburn, you start to unfold the complicated nature of this this approach to operationalize. We do have 147 school sites. We do have 74,000 students, and we do have 12,000 employees. And I think the question that was raised before around things like, for example, the representation of materials in a classroom, and a parent has called or a student indicates that the books that have been chosen are exclusionary and don't represent all the diversity of the community. This is shared with the teacher. The teacher amends that situation. It does fall into the bracket of an infraction, but then it becomes a question, is that reported then to the Office of the HREA? So I then wonder about the interpretation of this piece, and then what do you do with that? Because when we get into the exercise of collecting information as counting, it asks a question question, it begs a question about the capacity to be able to do anything about that. And so the range here that we're dealing with of who can report, what they can report on, what the observation is, you know, it can be written in a policy, but the capacity to be able to deliver on that in terms of measuring change is troublesome. I don't know that we could say that we could actually be able to meet that in terms of the nature of the volume that's there. So philosophically, it's problematic, but operationally, I never like to say anything is impossible, but I have a difficulty envisioning how it would actually be practically delivered.
Thank you, Madam Director, and I know that you have an immense amount of experience operationalizing stuff, and therefore I will bow to your expertise, and I will not be supporting this amendment.
Thank you very much, Trustee Blackburn. Moving on to Trustee Lara on the amendment.
Yeah, so I understand where the trustee is trying to go with this, but the sentence that the proposed amendment looks like is a mess. I can't support it in its current form, and I really do want to see us save that information. I want to see the information recorded at the Human Rights Office, because I do want us to be able to say, these are the complaints that we got. These are the ones that were remedied at the school level. These are the ones that were remedied at the principal level. These are the ones that were remedied by teachers. I think we should be collecting that data. But I think just tacking this half a sentence on the end of the existing sentence doesn't get us to that level. And so I'm not going to support the amendment in its current form, but I would love to see a rewrite of this come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Lara. Moving on to Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'd like to understand, I guess, what the motion's after. So I don't right now, I'll confess, because it is tangled language now, and I really wish we could have returned to this later in the meeting with properly worked out language. I wonder whether one of the existing ors could be converted to an and preserve the meaning. I'm not really quite sure what the meaning is. Is this all employees, not just the principal or vice principal? And what is an incident? Is it a complaint? Is it an outcome? I don't know. So I would almost prefer this as a separate clause. In any event, I think it needs a rewrite. I'm quite open to, I'm broadly sympathetic to the direction, I think. If it's operationalizable, that's a separate question. But at this time, I'm not even quite sure what it's trying to state. And in any event, even if that was clarified orally, the language would have to be remedied. So I would suggest in all humility that this be withdrawn and put again later in the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trustee Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand and appreciate what I think is the intent of this proposed amendment, but the language, to be blunt about it, simply makes no sense at all in the context of either of the sections where it was suggested to be placed. And I think one of the things we need to remember is that there is other language in here. For example, in section 4.9, which outlines the responsibilities of the Director of Education, 4.9F refers to monitoring and reporting on progress against human rights related indicators and measurements, which implies that somewhere in the procedures, there is going to be a form, a process, a mechanism for gathering the necessary data so that the director can in fact fulfill her obligation to do the reporting. I don't think that trying to presuppose parts of what the director might be able to put in place and operationalize so that she can fulfill that obligation for monitoring and reporting on progress, because that implies you need to know what it was before and what has happened and so on. I don't think this is the place for it. I think that is something that would come in the context of a procedure and looking at the different steps and how it could be done in a way that actually could be implemented practically. So I think that to a significant extent, the concept is already covered in terms of the expectations and obligations that we have in terms of what we expect the director to be doing. And even in section 410, where we are looking at the obligations of senior staff in terms of developing a plan and taking intentional action to address systemic human rights trends identified by the Office of the HREA, again, which implies that there must be somewhere in the procedures a mechanism to provide the necessary data to support the full fulfillment of those obligations. So I cannot support the proposed amendment in its current form, and I'm not entirely convinced that it is actually necessary because it is going to be more of a procedural thing, I think.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Ms. Lamba.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I understand the intent, whether it should be in this particular section. I'll leave it for you to debate. I do think it's actually really important, right? Because, you know, the experience I'm thinking of at a high school is where you know, the school thought that a certain human rights incident was dealt with fine, right? And it never went anywhere. It never got heard by anywhere. And suddenly it boomed and became a public media thing. So I actually think it's very important, whether it's the vice principal or the principal, they should have an obligation to report to the human rights and equity advisor, right, that an incident happened. Then the HREA can review it and say, yeah, they dealt with it fine, or oh no, that school or that you know, location needs some work because how they dealt with it wasn't appropriate. How are they going to know if there's no requirement to report, right? So that, and I believe that's in the policy because those are obligations. It's the what. What does the educator or person in authority has to do? How you do it, you know, what that mechanism looks like can be in the procedure. It can be a form, it can be, you know, on the internet, whatever. That's the how. But the what, they should report every incident, whether it's the, you know, the principal or the vice principal that has to do it. Somebody has to do it, right? And the other piece is there's got to be some sort of responsibility on the educator too. If something happens in their classroom and they think they've dealt with it fine because, you know, I understand we're trying to change culture and shift that, but how are you going to know you're doing it if there's no mechanism to measure it? How do you know that teacher handled it well? And what I'm hearing is with the current E, the responsibility is actually on the rights holder that has to take it to the HREA to say, hey, it wasn't dealt well with, you know, it wasn't dealt properly. Is somebody in elementary school able to do that? Like, so I actually think there needs to be some responsibilities on the educator or the administrator. So to be able to monitor it and oversee how it's going. The how can be dealt with differently, but the requirement of the what, that they need to do it, should be in the policy.
Thank you very much. And there's a comment from the director.
Thank you, Trustee Penny, Chair Penny. I think that in an ideal world, perhaps this makes sense. But when we think about the manner in which schools work and people engage, I just don't know what that would look like in a classroom where two teachers are having a conversation. One teacher says, I noticed that, your books or your practice, or I noticed that certain students, you haven't been allowing this group of students to respond, but you're allowing this group of students to respond more. The other teacher says, gee, I didn't realize that, and does some work on changing that. How is that reported? And so it does beg a question. Does that conversation, is that there an obligation for that teacher who made the observation, who had the conversation, to report her colleague's behavior to the office of the EHREA, and then say, and I spoke to the teacher and it seems to be rectified. What we're now creating is a culture of surveillance. And so when you're saying every infraction is reported, every infraction looks very, that is a mammoth undertaking. We know that in playground practice, when we see things happening in the playground, we may see that some unsafe behavior occurs, the unsafe behavior is intervened upon, a correction is made. If something is unsafe in the playground physically, it's addressed, and it's not necessarily every single infraction is not reported, because the scope and the range of infractions that we could see, some unintended, which is addressed in this policy, that we do have unintended outcomes that constitute an infraction, and a correction may be undertaken there. We see certain circumstances where it may be unintended, it is not undertaken and addressed. But when we say every infraction is reported by everybody to the HREA office, that not only becomes unmanageable, it becomes meaningless after a point, because there are certain pieces that it becomes surveillance. And what surveillance does is then you get no conversation, because if I have to have that conversation, then that means that, there's something else that is going to be involved, and I don't want to be involved in that. So we have to be careful about what we're talking about here when we talk about all, because we're talking about working with 4-year-olds in a classroom. We're talking about working with 18-year-olds in the hallways. We're talking about instruction. We're talking about work together. We're talking about co-op. We're talking about schisms. We're talking about the playground. We're talking about parents. So if you're talking about reporting each and every, I really can't imagine how that is either manageable or meaningful in any operational way.
Thank you very much. And I did have Trustee Ellis did have his hand up. Did you wish to have a question or have a comment, Trustee Ellis? No? Okay. So seeing no further comments or questions, moving back to Trustee Bell for wrap up on her amendment.
I just want to say thank you to my colleagues, and I do want to say thank you to the director as well for this conversation, and for SEMA in raising it. I think this is a really important point that deserves attention, because I do believe that there would be a way to make it manageable, and I would not agree that reporting to the Human Rights Office on cases that have been resolved would be, in fact, meaningless. However, I understand that there would be major considerations on the operationalization of it. And I do understand as well that how this policy has been framed, it's been framed in a way that wants to create a culture rather than, I guess, additional administrative burden. I am going to withdraw the amendment that's been put on the table. Again, I appreciate the conversation, and I will leave it up to my trustees who have the technical ability this evening and the bandwidth to bring it forth as a clarified motion should they wish. And I'm just going to excuse myself to put my daughter to sleep for a couple of minutes, and I'll be back on the meeting. So thanks everyone, and thank you to Human Rights Advisor Tanner. You've done an incredible job on this.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to check with the executive officer. I just want to follow all the rules here. So is Trustee Bell allowed to withdraw it, or do we need agreement from the rest of the trustees to withdraw the motion? Withdraw the. You're muted, executive officer.
Sorry, the sub-amendment was moved onto the floor. And so it needs agreement to be withdrawn.
Okay, so I'm just going to call the question then on that. I guess everyone in favor of withdrawal of the amendment by Trustee Bell, just speak out.
Bell in favor.
Lyra in favor.
Schwartz in favor.
Boothby in favor.
Ellis in favor.
Campbell in favor.
Kern in favor.
Jenikins in favor.
Scott in favor.
Penny in favor. And opposed? Thank you very much. Okay, so that's withdrawn. And moving down our list, the next one to speak on the main motion would be, we're back to the main motion, and the next one to speak is Trustee Ellis. Go ahead, Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. Let's first take a look at 3.9. And this speaks to, so I'm staying on protected grounds for a bit. So I can understand where it might just be protected grounds in 3.9. Am I correct in assuming that there would be no non-code considerations for 3.9?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Trustee Ellis. I'm just taking a moment.
Stop the clock, please.
Yes, this is talking about protected grounds. Now, you referenced code protected grounds, but what this policy does is expands protected grounds beyond what is in the Human Rights Code to also include socioeconomic disadvantage. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes, well, that's my next one. And I guess if we go up to 2.25, which is the definition for protected grounds, it references the code, which is the Ontario Code for Human Rights, or OCDSB, and a little later at the bottom of that definition, it adds an additional ground protected from discrimination at the OCDSB is socioeconomic disadvantage. So, and this goes back to our earlier thing where you took out protected grounds. Does protected grounds include conditions that the OCDSB sets out? And would those grounds be only socioeconomic disadvantage, or might there be other issues that the OCDSB brings into this mix?
So through you, Mr. Chair, under the current policy and the way the definition is written, whenever we refer to protected grounds, we are only referring to the grounds protected under the Human Rights Code plus socioeconomic disadvantage. So that's a closed list. It doesn't include anything else based on this definition. So if you wanted to expand protected grounds to be further than that, you would need to amend the definition.
I'm not looking to expand the definition of that. I'm just trying to come up with an understanding of what the definition is, because we took it out of the definitions up or below, I forget, because we wanted to include non-protected grounds. So, you know, when most people read protected grounds in relation to human rights, they think of these codes. Now we're adding an OCDSB specific socioeconomic factor to protected grounds. I'm just finding that may be confusing for people. You know, like why was the OCDSB included? Would an organization such as a school board normally be the arbiter of what is protected grounds in human rights?
Thank you, Trustee Ellis, and through you, Mr. Chair. So the short answer is yes. The Ontario Human Rights Code sets out the minimum standards, not the maximum. So it is common and possible to consider going above and beyond the minimum requirements of what you're required to do. And the the Ontario Human Rights Code actually does protect us, for example, people from discrimination when they're renting a house. You're not allowed to be discriminated against because you're in receipt of public assistance. But that's only in the code when you're renting a house. So the code does contemplate some sort of socioeconomic standard, but limits it to the social area of housing. We're suggesting expanding the protected ground to also include socioeconomic disadvantage because it's aligned with the social justice commitment of the OCDSB and the work that we're already doing with the strategic plan. It's also consistent with human rights code legislation in numerous other provinces that do in fact protect from discrimination on socioeconomic reasons. It just happens to be that in Ontario, it isn't currently protected. By intersection between poverty, for example, and grounds that are protected under the Human Rights Code are specifically recognized in the Ontario, for example, Poverty Act, and in various writings of the Ontario Human Rights Commission.
That's fine, thank you. I'm just, so there would be opportunities for us to, a trustee, to add other conditions than just socioeconomic that would then become part of protected grounds. Correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's a policy decision that the board could decide to make.
Okay.
In my view.
Right. So, but currently as this policy reads, protected ground is all of that within the HR human rights legislation with the additional OCDSB designated socioeconomic. Okay, thank you. And put me back on the list, please.
No problem, Trustee Ellis, doing just that. And moving on to Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start off by saying a big thank you to Human Rights Advisor Tanner for taking the time to speak with me for about an hour with this regarding this policy. And I do support the policy and the intention of the policy. My big concern is that the policy may be used for not its intent, that it could be used not to create a culture where we strive to do better, where we strive to understand each other better, but that it could be used to help create what I see around me is a culture of fear. And I want to ask a question about 2.33, the definition of vexatious complaint. I find that definition quite weak, and I did look it up, and I know it's a very legal one. But I think if somebody made a complaint against somebody, I want to know, I'm curious about the process. Would the complainant be able to speak publicly about the complaint and who the complaint is leveled against?
Through you, Mr. Chair, sorry, the reason for the long pause is I'm trying to remember specifically what's in the policy and what will end up being in the procedure. There's a duty of confidentiality while a complaint is moving forward, that the parties must maintain confidentiality about what is going on. So information is only shared on a need-to-know basis. So the complainants would not be able to publicly share the name of the person that the complaint was about.
Okay, thank you for that. I also have a question about, because it does talk about this policy in relation to our other policies. So for instance, if a principal suspends a student and they believe, and so as everyone should know at this table, trustees in particular, and staff, that if a student is suspended, they have a right to appeal that suspension or an expulsion or other things to a panel of trustees, which is a completely confidential process. But we have had cases where one side does not keep it confidential. But the question is, does this, if a case goes to appeal, the suspension is upheld by the panel of trustees, can they then take it further to the human rights, to you or to the Human Rights Office?
So through you, Mr. Chair, and I'm pausing because I need to think about that a little bit. It really depends on what's being complained about to the Human Rights Office. So if the complaint is that the person being discriminated, the person being suspended was discriminated against because of a protected ground, then in my view, they could bring their concern about discrimination to the Human Rights Office. However, the Office of the Human Rights and Equity Advisor does not have the jurisdiction to look into concerns about discrimination that involve trustees. That's governed by the Trustee Code of Conduct.
Oh, no, I'm not talking about the trustees. I'm talking about if a parent believes that their child was suspended based on a protected right, and then the trustees uphold the suspension, can they then take it further to the human rights, to your office, after the trustees have made a decision supporting the suspension?
So through you, Mr. Chair, my answer would be sometimes there can be a suspension. There was an action, there was a suspension. So there's a decision about that. But then there can be a separate complaint that the process somehow was discriminatory on the basis of protected grounds. So the Office of the HREA wouldn't be looking at the action of the child for which they were suspended. The Office of the HREA could look at the issue of whether or not there was discrimination at some point in that process. But we wouldn't be looking at whether there was discrimination in that process that was applied by trustees, for example, because that would be outside the scope of our office. I'm going to hand this over to the director in case Director Williams-Taylor has anything to add.
Director turned his camera on for a minute. A second, actually.
Thank you. Just for point of clarification, then I think that what the question is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Trustee Blackburn, is that a decision is made by the trustees that it is in fact a part of the disciplinary path. So it's not a unique action of the trustees, but it's rather a part of the disciplinary path that is outlined in our safe schools policies in terms of discipline. And so in a case where there is a finding that the family is unhappy with a disciplinary action that has been imposed, like a suspension or an expulsion, they have the right to appeal. They appeal, it is upheld, they are still on that path. And so if at the end of that path, they are still feeling like discrimination occurred, there is the opportunity to take that to the office of the HREA to follow up on the process that has been undertaken and whether or not any point in the process discrimination has in fact occurred. Prior to having the office of the HREA, that question could easily have been taken beyond the district to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Because again, the interrogation there is not about whether the decision was right or wrong or whether there was a malicious intent. It's a question of whether there has been a structural practice that has disadvantaged or discriminated against an individual person throughout whatever nature of the practice that is based on a protected ground. So that could be, in fact, investigated by the HREA, but the HREA would not be charged with upholding or overturning the decision of the panel. It would be a question of whether or not the practice undertaken by the district in that disciplinary path was in fact discriminatory or not.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And
Can I put you back? Can I put you back on the list, Trustee
I
Blackburn?
don't think I think most of my time was used up by answering. I don't think I spoke for that long.
Okay. Okay.
But I have one more question, just quick question. Are there any consequences if somebody brings forward a complaint and it is actually deemed vexatious?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Trustee Blackburn. So issuing or initiating a vexatious complaint is a policy violation. The Office of the HREA makes findings of fact and we make recommendations. So if we found facts that indicated that a complaint that was made was vexatious, we would make those findings of facts and make recommendations that it should be addressed, but the district, so the supervisor of that person, would have the responsibility for deciding on what kind of consequence would be applied, restorative, remedial, and progressive discipline as per the policy. So the Office of the HREA is not involved in discipline. The Office of the HREA is really involved in findings of fact and making recommendations for how to address and remediate the problem that arises. And then it becomes a situation for the district to determine actions to take next to address the issue.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to our second time speaker list. But at this current moment, it is time for a quick break. And if we could take 5 minutes and come back at 9:05, it'd be appreciated. So we'll see everyone back in about 5 minutes. Hello, everyone. I'm just wondering if trustees can turn their cameras on momentarily so that I can see if we have quorum. Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to move on to our second time speakers list. And that starts with trustee Lyra.
All right, I'm going to open by moving an amendment. 4.7F. Principals and or vice principals are responsible for reporting to the HREA the number, nature, and resolution of human rights incidents in a timely manner. And I have 2 minutes and 48 seconds when we come back.
So that's an additional clause, item F.
Yeah, it's in the chat. You are muted.
Would you like introduction, trustee Lyra?
Sure. So like I said earlier, I think it's really important that we gather this data at the Human Rights and Equity Advisor's Office. I think that if we want to be able to prove over time that we are improving, then we need to be able to collect that data. And as much as I understand the director's concerns about a culture of surveillance, I think anything that gets to the principal or vice principal level, any complaint that gets brought forward should be reported and should be recorded, because it means that we're going to be able to track these kinds of things. We had an incident at Nepean. We had many incidents at Nepean. And if we had seen that a huge number of results were coming in about these kinds of things that were being covered up, we'd have data to go back and say, here's why nothing was done about it, or here's what was done that wasn't sufficient. And I really think if we don't have this kind of mandatory reporting oversight, we're leaving ourselves susceptible to that kind of situation in the future.
Thank you very much. And trustee Lyra, I'm assuming your first word is principals as in the school principal, not.
It is, yes, principals.
Okay, okay, thank you. So we are, we do have a question or a comment from trustee Blackburn. Go ahead. I think you're muted, trustee Blackburn.
Thank you. Sorry about that, Mr. Chair. Thank you. So I guess my question would be to the director of education. Is she any more comfortable with this amendment than the amendment that trustee Bell put forward? Because again, I think what we're trying to create, and I wouldn't want to, based on what you said previously, we are trying to create a culture of doing better, not a culture of fear, of worrying about every interaction that you could possibly have that could be construed in a certain way. So yeah, so I'm just really concerned about this operationally and the, not only operationally on the Office of the Human Rights, that doesn't have a large staff as of yet. And I don't think we would want to expand it to huge amounts of numbers to get it watered down. So yeah, so I'd like a comment from the director, please.
Madam Director.
Thanks for you, Chair. I recognize that the value of the cultural piece may not resonate in the same way that it does for some as for others. I think there is a concern here about compliance and accountability and measurement of fact, and I think that because of the operational barriers that I've identified. It also begs a question about the factual nature of the collection of this kind of information. When I walk out, for example, some of the kinds of practices and engagements and way in which schools engage and work, there are things in some schools that will be recognized or reported, and there will be things that are not. I'm thinking about the situation in the lunchroom where a child's a comment is made by a staff member about a child's lunch, and that becomes addressed or corrected, by another staff member. How does anybody know to report that? So I don't know about how reliable that information will be. Certainly, if it is something that is passed, we will do our best to make that collection. But we won't know what hasn't been reported because there's no way to know that. The undermining of the culture piece by advancing and giving priority to the compliance piece disallows us from building the kind of culture of practice that we're expecting to build. If that is where the priority is placed, it is, then that is where the priority is placed. That's not where we have placed our priority. Our goal here has been more around moving forward a culture of practice as opposed to a culture of compliance, which in my experience doesn't yield a lot of change. And I've said publicly before, and I will say it again, that change actually, if change could happen because a policy was written, we would not be having this conversation. I have been in this conversation for 30 years. And in my experience, it is not a policy that creates the kind of change that we want to see. It is practice and behavior.
Thank you, Madam Director, for that. And I know I would assume that we're roughly the same age, and that's also my experience. And I think I hope that my colleagues and the people around this table actually have listened carefully to what you have said, because at the end of the day, we want to do better. We want
Chair,
things to
excuse
happen.
me. I have to take umbrage at the characterization that if we don't agree with the director and Trustee Blackburn, that we're not paying attention.
I think that Trustee Blackburn just merely requested that we pay attention. However, I would just remind Trustee Blackburn that just to not make any characterizations. So go ahead, keep going, Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would have to go back and look at the record, but I don't believe I said pay attention. Maybe I did. I guess what I'm trying to get at, and if anybody was offended by my comment, that was not my intent to offend anybody. I guess my point is that we have a director of education who has a substantial amount of experience, both in the equity field and as a person who is an expert in education. So we are doubly blessed to have her during this conversation. I'm simply requesting respectfully that we take into consideration what she has said in order that we actually meet our goals of creating a better culture for all our students and all the differences that they have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Ms. Miller.
Policies, you know what, it'd be nice if we could just say, let's have a culture where everyone's respected and we're all going to do the right thing. But there are always those who don't care. And those people who don't care, we need these policies for them. And secondly, it is possible to operationalize this, I think. Having worked in the schools, I've done my, I don't know how many incident reports, maybe hundreds, working in spec ed. And it just has to be done. You do it. It has to be done. And this can be done too. Maybe there's a way to streamline it so it's not so burdensome on those reporting and those collecting, but it is possible. And finally, it's so important. We're talking about human rights in the school. If anything is reported, like this should be a priority. It's not enough just to say, let's do this. You know, we really have to make sure it's done, have accountability, and then have the data that for making decisions in the future based on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And going to Chair Scott, go ahead.
Thank you. Again, I appreciate the intent of this proposed amendment, but I really have a lot of problem with the wording and the nature of the wording. For example, it talks about human rights incidents. Well, what is a human rights incident? I mean, this is a policy. Are we talking about violations of the policy? Are we talking about allegations that the policy has been violated? Those things are unclear. There may be allegations made that are untrue, and the resolution is to get everybody's head into the right space. There are other allegations that are definitely true, and where there is going to be remediation required and to arrive at a good resolution. But how do you distinguish among those things? Who is responsible for distinguishing among those things? And when we already have an expectation in this policy that there will be monitoring, which presumes collecting data so that progress can be assessed, I really think that it should be left to the director to bring forward a process as part of the procedure that will accompany this policy, and to leave the policy expectations that there will be monitoring and reporting as part of the policy, without getting into more detail that starts to be so specific that it could potentially be difficult, if not impossible, to implement, and underline the main objective of the policy, which is indeed to change our culture and our practice.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a better worded. I think the two should be an of in any event. In timely manner could be moved, fine, but I can live with it. I guess what I'm wondering though, I guess I'm sympathetic to the general thrust. I am concerned about operationalizing, and suggesting to everybody that everybody is on public and central oversight for every little thing that occurs within a school. So I guess what I'm wondering is whether there's a saw-off position here, wherein the reporting obligation is sufficiently high or serious to be effectively worthy report. So for instance, incident would be school-based administration determination that there was a human rights violation. And that it would be, what would be reportable is anything leading to a school-based sanction or disciplinary action. This would presumably be a very small percentage. And for the most part, administrations wouldn't have to worry about things. Right now, I believe they have to write up disciplinary actions and sanctions. So I guess what I'm wondering is maybe between now and board, if we could think of something that might be a bit of a saw-off. My concern, I take the arguments around creating the culture, not miscalibrating how we do cultural creation around here, and that risk and that danger. But the I guess the lens I use, though I care about the culture, as a Board of Trustees member, is sort of the monitoring and oversight piece, right? So if we're minus certain information, then how are we going to pick up on trends across schools that may have budget implications or may have policy implications if we don't have eyes into that, at least at some level of generality. And I guess I look for a staff comment around that, and I'll continue to reflect and listen to the debate.
Madam Director.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. I take the point pertaining to the notion of the saw off, and certainly something that's worth taking away because it depends on. I guess that goes to the question of the nature of the transgressions that want to be collected that make the threshold for data. Frankly, that makes more sense to my consideration when we start to think about what is reportable, and it will create a frame for reporting that might render such reports more meaningful when trustees do look at the data, so that there is a sense of the nature of the meaningfulness. But again, it is, and I suppose it would go to the procedure around the nature of the kind of reporting that would happen, so that we are able to meet the data goal that is trying to be achieved, which is to say, where are the thresholds that we're seeing infractions, what are the patterns. But I think to Trustee Scott's earlier comment, this may actually have been, and I don't have my my policy in front of me here, I can't reach it, it's charging. But it's the comment in the earlier part of the policy that speaks to the director's responsibility around reporting on the data generated through the HREA's office. So there is data that is coming to the HRE's office through some of the practice. If there's an expectation for some reporting to happen, to Ms. Miller's comment before, there is an expectation for different kinds of reports to be submitted, but they are clearly defined, and there's a threshold that's established so that when you look at that data, you know what you're reading because it has some common thread.
So with that, Mr. Chair, I guess I'll propose a sub-amendment. And that would be, sorry, I wasn't sure if I would, so I don't have the text, I can read it out. And that would be to, let me just get the right, I'm working on a small laptop screen here, which is not advisable. Excuse me, forgive me, okay. Reporting, okay, reporting to HRA, the number, nature, and resolution, I would suggest then substituting of determined human rights violations leading to school-based sanctions or disciplinary actions. And really with the threshold, I mean, the directors to implement via procedure in all things, and really the exact thresholds and the nature of the training and the nature of the guidance provided to school administrators, obviously to be determined by staff, but it's sort of capturing the general idea.
Okay, Manager Guthrie, did you get the amendment? I think she's just reviewing the words, Trustee Campbell, in order to put it on the screen for us. I'm thinking.
Through you, Chair Penny, I did not get the exact wording, as there was some conversation with respect to placement while the amendment was being laid out. So I would appreciate if you could put it in the chat.
No problem, if I may, Mr. Chair, then. And sorry for not having the text at the ready as crafting in response to the director's, what I extracted in any event, the director's reply. So what I suggest would be including from the word to onwards is replacing with the text. So replacing the word to as well. Of determined human rights violations leading to school-based sanctions or disciplinary actions. And I'll just throw in my wrap up, if that's okay, while the typing is going on, Mr. Chair. This presumably would mean that quiet conversations and corrective actions and all kinds of complaints which weren't determined by the principal to be actual human rights or designate, be it actual human rights violation, not rising really to the threshold as set out in procedure, presumably wouldn't be reported. And if there was, quiet agreements to modify behavior, do you really think this is wise to do, et cetera, would not be included. This would be only something actually leading to, actual sanctions or disciplinary action. I believe we already may, in large part, report on those things. So that is my offered saw off. There you go.
This is your introduction, then, Trustee Campbell.
And that was my introduction.
Okay. And I did have Trustee Ellis and Ms. Lamba on the original amendment, but on the sub-amendment, I'm just wondering, the first hand that I did see was Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll once again ask the director her views on this amendment.
Thank you through you, Chair. And I have had some feedback from HREA Tanner, who has some concern and some commentary about some unintended outcome of this type of practice. So I'll turn it to HREA Tanner just to illuminate what operationalizing this could look like in terms of impact on our system. So HREA Tanner, to you.
Thank you, Madam Director.
Thanks very much, Director Williams-Taylor, and thank you, Trustee Blackburn, for the questions. So I am all for transparency and accountability. I think it's important. I have concerns about the amendments. As soon as we put on, I understand the intention, but the concerns that I have in terms of unintended impact, when we limit it to leading to school-based sanctions or disciplinary actions, this could have the unintended impact of having people decide, you know what, I'm not going to give sanctions or disciplinary actions because I don't want to report. So what it could have is the unintended impact of things that should be taken seriously, sort of being put into the minimized category to avoid the necessity of reporting and to avoid that oversight that's going to come with reporting. I also am wondering whether we could add in words perhaps as set out in procedure, because that would give the opportunity to sort of work through and address some and think through some of the potential impacts of what's being described in more detail in procedure. But an unintended impact of this, when we limit it to solely school-based sanctions or disciplinary actions, is that things that are on the fence won't get an appropriate response because of the reporting obligation that goes with it. I'm worried about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And we have Trustee Lyra.
So, yeah, so I'm not going to be supporting this amendment. I left human rights incidents intentionally vague so that the director could decide what met the threshold of an incident in the procedure. I think this is too prescriptive, and I hadn't thought of it, but now that Carolyn has said that we might be pushing fence sitters on onto the wrong side of the fence to not report things to the appropriate level because they don't want to do more paperwork, I cannot support this amendment, this sub-amendment.
Thank you. Moving on to Ms. Lamba.
I would also say that this doesn't solve the issue that Trustee Lyra had raised around with one of the schools where there's incidences and it wasn't reported because there was no sanctions or disciplinary, right? So I don't think it captures significant incidences where you know, maybe there should have been sanctions, but there weren't. So that's important. But the other thing I was going to say is that around the human rights incidences, that can be part of when the rollout of the policy happens, that can be defined. That can be, you know, sort of, principals or vice principals, educators, they can be educated on what is meant by human rights incidences. So there is a line and everybody knows what it is, right? Like I'm hearing, oh, well, people are going to have different interpretations of it. Well, isn't that going to be part of the rollout and the education on the policy if this passes, so that people have understand that? And I agree, it can also be expanded on in the procedures where it should be, as to giving examples of what that looks like. And I just wanted to add my experience when there isn't sort of an accountability like this in the monitoring and account, from my 20 years of experience, nothing changed. The culture didn't change. There was no accountability. People didn't have to report it. So I did see there's some accountability with performance appraisals, and that's good. But this is also another mechanism to bring about cultural change. When people have to put their mind to it and they need to report something once they've been educated on what, that does bring about cultural change. People will change their behaviors because they got to report it on how they dealt with it. So it has a good intention too, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Trustee Ellis.
Thank you. I'd like to explore this notion of paperwork stopping people from reporting, in the sense that certainly some paperwork needs to be generated to document these things. And I think this is one of the failings. I mean, this has always been a challenge, and I know there's been policies written with very specifics in it because the procedures didn't reflect the intent of what the policymakers were trying to do at the time, going back a few years. So I guess maybe if I could get a comment and an idea of what would trigger some paperwork, and although it's very vaguely mentioned in another place that the director will report, but this is part of the procedures. I'm wondering how the director envisions reporting to trustees, I don't know, annually, biannually, so that we as trustees can fulfill our oversight obligations of this particular policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Ellis, and through you, Chair. And so while it is that certainly the procedures haven't necessarily been constructed or rolled out at this point, and are still certainly in our thinking, the vision around the reporting to trustees on this would be that on a cyclical nature or cyclical basis, the Office of the Human Rights and Equity Advisor would in fact be generating a report on nature of complaints, perhaps not in number by quantity, or maybe by quantity, but with trends that are identified. The spirit and intent here of the structure of the HREA's office is not necessarily to kind of have a trailing approach, which is something happens then correct it, but rather looking at trends and patterns in the data that comes through that office to say, this is why it reports to the Office of the Director, Madam Director, we have a problem here because we are seeing that this is a pattern that is occurring in X place. We are getting, a number of complaints about this kind of thing, and these are the recommendations that we expect to see or we are putting forward to remedy. And those are the kinds of things that would go forward to trustees as a cyclical report, whether it's twice a year, whether it's once a year, or whatever the decision is. And then that would allow for trustees to be able to say, I noticed that these trends have been happening in terms of transgressions, breaches of human rights. How is it that it's being monitored? How are you changing this? How will you know that it has changed? That becomes my responsibility to respond to that question and to generate the way in which that is going to be able to be done. So when you ask how it is I envision the reporting, that was the vision. It was more around systemic and structural practices in order to see that change across the system.
Thank you. So would it be fair to say that we will still probably be more dependent on our student surveys, the student achievement annual report to see, since we do have some indication as to groups, minorities, and that on how they're doing? That would be probably a more important tool to see how we're doing on student outcomes and equity than depending on the human resource report.
So I would be careful about saying the words more important because again, it depends on where it is that you premise your focus. I do agree, Trustee Ellis, that with a focus on student outcomes and student achievement, those data sets are very important to continue to report on. There may be an intersection between those reports and this report, but they mean different things. And you're quite right in making a distinction between the purposes of those reporting, and it is a dependence on what it is that you're trying to change that would cause you to want to see different kinds of reports. So those reports would still be important and you would still be expecting to see them.
So under the current sub-amendment that we're looking at, it does give some criteria. Do you feel, Director, that you have some latitude in determining some of the triggering, I don't have it in front of me anymore, but do you feel, Director, that you have some latitude in determining what human rights violations and the intensity leading to school-based sanctioned disciplinary actions, or do you feel you have no leeway as it's currently written?
Thank you through your chair and to Trustee Ellis. I think that it's a very narrow scope, that where it is that there's a potential for an unintended outcome or an unintended harm, I think that we need to be cautious. And so I think that the latitude would be better served in a procedure. It does narrow the latitude in a way that might interfere with the goal that the trustees had about the data that they would like to see. You're muted, sir.
I didn't mute when you were talking. Sorry. Does this doesn't mention the HREA officer, so this would limit reporting only for school-based incidents reported to the VP or principal. Comment on that?
Okay, so I'm having a hard time keeping track. I'm trying to see the I'm squinting because I'm trying to see the amendment that you're referring to. So it does say, from what I can see, principal and or vice principal are responsible for reporting to the HREA the number, nature, and resolution of determined human rights violations leading to school-based sanctions or disciplinary action in a timely manner. So I think that that's what we're commenting on, Trustee Ellis, to be clear. Yes?
My question was, does this exclude, would this exclude things that were reported and handled by the HREA?
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. I do think that what we would have to do is we would have to look at the intersection and fold that into what the HREA would be reporting on anyway, because I do think that basically what you're looking for is a report on data coming out of the HREA's office, is what I believe we're seeking here. And what this amendment does is it creates a category within that reporting that is about what has happened in schools being reported based on a disciplinary action in schools. So there probably will be multiple categories of reporting that will come through the HREA office, and this amendment creates one such category. So I don't think it precludes the other information, but it creates a column that is different.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to Trustee Scott.
Thank you. Once again, I have a huge problem with this sub-amendment. It is so narrow in scope, and I think it really takes the focus away from what our objective with this policy would be, which is to educate students, families, staff across the district in how to recognize and refrain from committing human rights violations. What we want to do is to see some significant behavior change, and that is a matter of learning. If we focus only on the punitive end of things, I think we are undermining the whole purpose, so I can't support this.
Thank you very much, Trustee Scott. And moving it back to Trustee Campbell for wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I attempted to try and sneak in a withdrawal, but I do have a question to the director, if I may, and I very much appreciate the conversation here. What I was attempting to do, yes, was to narrow the obligation, because without some kind of amendment along these lines, there would not necessarily be any reporting from the school of incidents, quote unquote, reported to school admins to the HREA. And that data would be simply missing from any reporting. So in a sense, I've heard concerns of any reporting and concerns of too narrow reporting. I understand that. What I was indeed seeking to do was to limit the overall reporting obligation to something sensible. However, my question to the director here is, if the sub-amendment were to be happily defeated or withdrawn, and the original text were to remain, which nebulously referred to incidents, which could be defined by the director in procedures at a sufficiently high threshold level and sufficiently guardrailed terms, such that the reporting obligation would not be onerous. Would that be more, would that be the director's preferred direction?
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. So I'm trying to determine if you mean the amendment, because you were talking about sub-amendment, but right. So the amendment that reads, principals and or vice principals are responsible for reporting to the HREA the number, nature, and resolution of determined human rights violations in a timely manner.
Incidents is the original word. Incidents in a timely manner. That's the original wording. I maybe replacing the two with an of. In any event, if that original wording were to stand, and you together with staff were able to develop procedures which defined an incident in a sufficiently discriminating way, so the reporting obligation would not be massive, and would be feasible and would be generally useful from a data crunching perspective, would that satisfy your concerns and the concerns of the HREA?
Thank you, through you, Chair. I think that from an operational point of view, it may create a sphere or a scope that would allow the data to be meaningful and consistently understood. I will turn it to HREA Tanner, as she is expert in some of the nuances here that I may miss. So can I ask for HREA Tanner to comment?
Thank you, Director and Trustee Campbell, and through you, Mr. Chair. So just to make sure I'm clear, the amendment as it was originally proposed by Trustee Lyra, substituting resolution of for 2 human rights incidents in a timely manner, I think that works from my perspective. I think data is important, but the type of data we need is equally as important, right? And that does need to be defined somewhere. And I think that can be defined in the procedure. And I think it addresses my concerns and the concerns expressed by Ms. Lamba around not capturing those incidents.
Excellent. All I was trying to do is help. Mr. Chair, I think we're going to have to vote on either my withdrawal or defeat of the amendment. It's your call.
And so, Trustee Campbell, it's actually your decision since you had wrap up. So do you?
I'll withdraw if I can. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Is everyone in favor of Trustee Campbell withdrawing his sub-amendment?
Lyra in favor.
Up in favor.
Schwartz in favor.
Blackburn in favor.
Jenkins in favor.
Campbell in favor.
Any in favor? And opposed? All right, so that sub-amendment has been withdrawn, and I believe Trustee Campbell, we're going to move on to Trustee.
Absolutely nothing further. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Trustee Ellis, you are on my list for the amendment, then followed by Ms. Lamba. So go ahead, Trustee Ellis.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I'll be supporting the amendment.
Thank you. And Ms. Lamba?
I think I already said what I said during the amendments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And that is the end of the speakers list for the amendment. And we're going to go back to Trustee Lyra for a wrap up for the amendment.
So I'm glad we had a chance to sort of talk it out through Trustee Campbell's sub-amendment, given that the director would feel comfortable defining incident in the procedure, I would like all of my colleagues to support this, because I do think the data collection and oversight is an important part of our responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And with that, I'm going to call a question on this amendment. I'm going to have to write this down. So if we could just be very pedantic with our voting. So all those in favor?
Trustee Lyra in favor.
Ellis in favor.
Up in favor.
Bell in favor.
So right now I have Lyra, Campbell, Ellis, Huff, and Bell in favor. Is there anyone else?
Boothby in favor.
All right, and
Sorry,
opposed?
Jennings in favor. Sorry.
No problem. And opposed?
Opposed.
Schwartz opposed.
Scott opposed.
Any opposed? All right, thank you very much. And that motion passes. And so the amendment is in effect. And Lyra, you said you had 2 minutes and 48 seconds remaining.
I do, thank you. I had some questions about the motion in its entirety. So, Ms. Tanner, earlier you mentioned that someone who files a complaint can't speak publicly about something. Are we expecting students who feel their rights are violated to not talk with their parents or peers or the media? Or would that prohibition only apply to staff?
Look, it's through you, Mr. Chair. It's a good question, and I think it's one that we need to wrestle with a little bit in the procedure. So right now, what the policy does is the policy says concerns, sorry, I'm just looking at 4.36 in the policy. And it says concerns and complaints shall be treated in a confidential manner by the district, except on a need-to-know basis as permitted by law or as permitted in related procedures. So that puts the obligation for confidentiality on the district. And then it does a similar thing with accommodations. And then the procedure will get into what information can be shared. Currently, if I'm not mistaken, in the respectful workplace procedure, for example, where there's an investigation of harassment under the respectful workplace procedure, there is a duty of confidentiality and not to share information about the process while it's underway. But that is a procedural item, and I see where you're going with students. And it's something we need to think about. And I think it's something we need to think about as well in terms of resolution of an issue. Who can waive the duty of confidentiality and at what point, and who has the right to do so, and what information. We need to look at MFIPA as well to see how that relates to our duty and information that's shared that way.
Would it be unrealistic to hope for an answer come board?
I believe it's a procedural thing, and we're still grappling with the ins and outs and nuances of the procedure. So I think wouldn't want to undertake that. I could definitely provide it by board. There's a pretty short distance between now and then.
All right. So also earlier, you mentioned concerns around empty and unfulfilled promises. I very much share those concerns. Would you agree that marginalized communities have been fed platitudes in place of action by institutions in the past, and therefore those communities may be suspicious or skeptical of institutions claiming to make changes without proof?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think the results of the survey that we did were quite clear, right? We had about 1,700 respondents. We asked them about their concerns. I had public information sessions. People, lack of trust is a significant issue, and it will take work to rebuild trust. And I think the Ministry of Education recognizes that, right? That's why they're establishing this kind of role in so many different districts, because they're trying to create an institution that can kind of rebuild trust or create trust for the first time with marginalized communities in particular, and people who have human rights concerns that haven't traditionally been acknowledged by institutions that are recognized to have problems with systemic discrimination. So yes, I think that's a fair statement.
Okay.
If I may, I think there's an amendment I'd just like to add to that comment because the trustee indicated without proof, and the proof actually is in the experience. It's not in the number. When we say to questioning and querying communities, see, look at what we've done. We had this number before, and now we have this number, but they haven't felt a change in terms of their experience. It doesn't matter that the number has changed. That is a defensible position the organization can take, but it doesn't really move the confidence because people haven't felt the change. So this is why I do go back to the experience of what is, or the commentary about what is experienced, that we can prioritize quantitative difference, and we are able to demonstrate quantitative difference, but we can say it all we like. It doesn't matter what the numbers tell us if people aren't feeling an experience that is different.
Yeah, so thank you, Director. 4.14D says they were to provide public reports. Is this intended to provide the proof that I mentioned and the Director has said is not the only thing, to try and show the marginalized communities that we're making changes? Is that part of the intent of these reports?
Through you, Chair, I'll take the question there. I think that the intent of those reports is the accountability to ourselves and to trustees around commitment and practice. So where it is that we've said that we're going to do something, it's a demonstration that we are doing it. And the question of impact then comes because what happens is when you ask a question of impact, even though you've done the things that you've said you're going to do, but they haven't changed anything, then that allows for a different question to be asked: are these the right things to do? And so it's not necessarily an undertaking of proof, but it's rather an undertaking of a demonstration of adherence to our commitment, and that's a transparency piece. And with that transparency piece and being able to show that we have undertaken the work in these ways, we're able then to try to get ahead, try to change our organization in ways that people will feel a difference in the experiences that they're having.
Okay. 4.4 says this applies to all parts of employment. I assume this policy applies to the disciplinary process for staff.
Ms. Tanner, would you care to respond?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Trustee Lyra. So our legal human rights obligations not to discriminate apply through the entire employment process. So that would also include any discipline that was being engaged in with staff as well. So yeah, it applies to all aspects of employment.
Okay. It's my recollection that our collective agreements have clauses where disciplinary measures are kept private. 4.5 says that conflict between this and other policies favors this one. And it also says that conflicts between this and human rights law favors the law. Do we know if this will have precedent over collective agreements, or if collective agreements will have precedence over this, if there's a conflict?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So Trustee Lara, at the start of the policy, it does speak at 4.5 B, that when there's inconsistency between collective agreements and human rights law prevails. So any agreement, you can't contract out of your human rights obligations. So anything that exists as a human rights obligation exists notwithstanding something else that might be written down.
The question was a conflict between this policy and a collective agreement, not between human rights and a collective agreement, or human rights law and a collective agreement.
On my reading of what we've written here and on the intention, if the collective agreement is not aligned with human rights law, that would be the limitation on the collective agreement. I don't believe that this policy can change what's already in a collective agreement, but I will defer to the director to direct this to someone who can provide actual legal advice on that, because that's not my role.
So thank you, Ms. Tanner. And I would say that this is not about legal advice, because we don't do legal advice in public, but I would say that Superintendent McCoy's interpretation of the question may be illuminating. So Superintendent McCoy.
Thank you, Director, and through you, Chair. I would support what HREA Tanner has said, that where there is a conflict between a collective agreement and human rights law, certainly the human rights law would prevail. However, where there's a conflict between policy and collective agreement, that in general, the collective agreement would prevail. And so without getting into the specifics in terms of the provision that you were talking to Trustee Lyra, I think that's just sort of a general premise.
Okay. So as an example, many members of my community have watched police officers violate human rights and be brought under various investigations. And from the outside, we see no change. The violating officers may have taken trainings or may have been removed for consideration from promotions, but because the public never finds out, the community distrusts the whole accountability system. Given that you have said that the collective agreements have precedence, how will this policy improve public accountability when a person or community feels that their human rights have been violated by an individual staff member, but we cannot inform them about actions that have been taken? And so to the outside observer, nothing has changed.
Through you, Chair, I would suggest that this is a procedure question. I don't know that this is a policy question, and I'm not really sure that we would be able to respond to that question in terms of adjusting the policy. And so I think if that is a question that wants to be interrogated, perhaps that feedback can be taken away and looked at in terms of how it is we carry out that piece. Because what I hear a question here is about the communicating back to community, communicating back to individual people about specific responses to individuals' behaviors. And so the question around privacy, question around obligation for progressive discipline, the question of how it is that personal information, if you will, is communicated. That is pretty complicated. It is pretty complex. There are multiple layers of law that speak to that. And the other piece of it is there are multiple layers of impact that has on a variety of different people. So I can't give an easy answer. I would guess that as wise as Ms. Tanner and Superintendent McCoy are, they probably would not venture down that road in this particular time, because this is not the place to oversimplify something as complex as the question that's being asked.
I understand. Thank you, Director. I do want to have this conversation, because the part of this policy that I am most excited for is actually under the objectives 1C. And about part of this policy's objective is to build community accountability, and institutions obfuscating what they're doing to try and improve things has never helped community accountability. And so I do want to take time at some point in the future to try and nuance out what we can do when it comes to public reporting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, Chair, just in response to that, I think that the trustee has raised a really important point. And one of the things that I wanted to raise is that there are multiple platforms of action. And so when we do start looking at some of the reporting on our strategic action plans around the roadmap, the opportunities to actually speak to the behaviors and the actions and the implementation and the opportunities that we have. I do hope and invite the trustee to bring those pieces forward from those intersectionality pieces, because it's the action items there that will allow us to undertake. So I don't want there to be a feeling that this is the one platform for the conversation. We certainly do anticipate that there are multiple platforms for the conversation. And we would invite not only the trustee, but also our non-voting members who sit at some of these other tables to be able to bring those conversations forward.
Okay, thank you, Director. Can I get back on the list?
Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
I would like to remind trustees that we do have another report to consider this evening. I realize that this is important, but we're 3 hours into it, so just a note of reminder. And we're going to move on to Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try and do what I can within the 3 minutes. So first of all, I'd like to move the amendment in the chat, which is really picking up from Ms. Lambda, and I believe the HREA's comments, at least with respect to this item, was that they were open to the suggestion. So this after 3.5A, after the word equal, add the words and equitable, and including after 3.6, after the word equality, replace the first and with comma equity. I believe that's in line with Mrs. Landa's suggestion and what the HREA considered, and that is my introduction as well. Thank you.
Chair, you are muted.
Thank you, Trustee Lara. Sometimes the space bar doesn't work, but anyway, is this friendly? And if this is not friendly, someone just speak out. All right, it looks like it's friendly, so I'm going to call the question this. All those in favor of the amendments that Trustee Campbell put forward?
Campbell in favor.
Lyra in favor.
Ellis in favor.
Scott in favor.
Boothby in favor.
Jennings in favor.
Schwartz in favor.
Huff
Bell
in
in
favor.
favor.
Blackburn in favor.
Any in favor? All right, that passes.
Next tweaky amendment, Mr. Chair, also now in the chat, that 4.13 be prefaced with the additional new words, in addition to the obligations of persons in positions of authority, comma. Also, per my understanding of Ms. Seema's logic, I don't know that we had a clear understanding in the debate that ensued. My introduction would be that I think this has to be the implication, given all the preceding clauses, and I believe that's what Ms. Lambda was indicating as well. If the addition of these words is not aligned with the staff's intent, then I would need to know that. Thank you.
And so the amendment looks like 413, instead of saying educators have the following obligations, it would say, in addition to the obligations of persons in positions of authority, educators have the following obligations. Does that capture it, Trustee Campbell?
That would be correct. Yeah.
And it doesn't look like this is friendly because we have a hand up from Trustee Scott. No?
It's friendly.
Okay. If this is not friendly, then please speak out. Thank you very much. So I'm going to, since this is friendly, I'm going to call a question. All those in favor of the amendment?
Campbell in favor.
Lyra in favor.
Bell in favor.
Words in favor.
Scott in favor.
In favor.
Off in favor.
Jennings in favor.
And opposed? And that passes.
Not seeing my clock, Mr. Chair. I'm sure I had time left. I don't think I had 3 minutes left. I'll take it, but
No, don't have 3 minutes left.
2 minutes. Okay, I'll take that. Thank you. So I guess a question before a possible amendment, a question to staff. One of my concerns is about the interpretation of the undue hardship provision. As the draft policy states, staff, I believe it'd be the director designates a responsibility fundamentally to basically respond to recommendations from the HREA with respect to accommodations and other things. There are 3 declared grounds for declarations of undue hardship by district staff, which are enshrined. I forget the reference, but folks will know. But these grounds for assertions of undue hardship don't provide thresholds, right? It has to be interpreted. The policy does say demonstrably justified or something, but it's unclear who that has to be justified to and what the thresholds would be and what would be accepted by whom. I'm not suggesting we set out thresholds in the this policy. What I am suggesting is that where the district asserts undue hardship provisions may be well justified with respect to not just essentially one case, but perhaps more than one case. There are trends, say, with respect to school exclusions or in other cases that we need to know as a board of trustees and the public needs to know where we are asserting undue hardship provisions because there are budget implications, there are policy implications, right? There are monitoring obligation implications for the board of trustees. So I'm sort of wondering if I get a staff comment on that.
I'll ask Ms. Tanner to comment on that, as that's where her expertise lies around the understanding of undue hardship.
Thank you, Madam Director and Trustee Campbell, through you, Mr. Chair. So the process, I think, will provide more clarity around this assertion of undue hardship. And how it's determined and how it's demonstrated. Right now, I'm not aware, and I might be wrong on this, but I'm not aware of an accountability mechanism built into how we operate in the district that has us take a second look at when we're determining we can't provide an accommodation because of undue hardship. I think the accountability mechanism we have right now is an appeal or an escalation of the person who's not satisfied with the response to their request for accommodation to the next level. So currently, for some cases, that will be dealt with under the existing complaints policy and procedure that the district has. And I'm less familiar with this, and someone else may be better positioned to answer how we deal with denials of accommodation requests for undue hardship on special education needs. I'm not as familiar with that process right now, but under this policy should provide the general framework across the district for the standards that need to be adhered to when we're assessing requests for accommodation, because our legal obligation is the same, whichever policy we're applying. And the legal standard is that you can only claim undue hardship if you meet, if there are health and safety reasons, if there's no funding available to offset the health and safety, to offset costs. So costs and health and safety. And if there's no funding to offset the costs, then you can claim undue hardship, essentially. So I'm not aware currently of a mechanism in here that where accountability is built in. Perhaps the director may have something she would like to add to that, though. Thank you.
No, I do not have anything to add.
Thank you. That is helpful. So I'm suggesting an amendment to 4.9F to insert the words just before the semicolon, including the general rationale and related incidence rates for district denials of full accommodation on an undue hardship basis. Can provide introduction, Mr. Chair. It's in the chat. Shall I go ahead, Mr. Chair?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the general idea here is to ensure, I'm not attempting, I wouldn't attempt to try and determine in policy, I don't know if we determine procedure, what constituted valid thresholds for cost, whatever. I mean, yes, money may not be lying on the table, but obviously people are going to reprioritize budget allocations. So, where does the line lie, right? And so I think it will have to be evaluated, and it would be sort of a reasonable evaluation kind of criterion kind of thing. I think at the end of the day, there are a lot of pressures upon the board and the district. I think everybody understands that. But I think that what is important, again, I'm thinking again of the role of the Board of Trustees, right? Is I believe it's important for us to understand where and when we are, if there are any. There may be exceedingly few. I don't know if there are any right now, denials of accommodation based on undue hardship. Maybe only a handful. I have no idea. But but I think it's incumbent upon us to know where they exist, and especially if there are trends that way, because there are potential budget priority questions, right? There are potential policy questions, and it is also, as I mentioned, a role that one of the roles of the Board of Trustees to monitor the implementation of their policies. So. I think I put this under the director's reporting obligation as opposed to the, that's what I'm proposing anyway, as opposed to the OHREA's obligation, because it is the director's responsibility to respond to OHREA recommendations, and the director or their designate to, in fact, to come up with a rationale, if there is one, and if that's the outcome, to deny based on undue hardship. And really, at the end of the day, only the director or their designate can provide that rationale. So that's the impetus behind this.
Thank you. And based upon Trustee Blackburn's hand up, I take it this is not friendly.
I think I'll let the director speak before I do.
Okay, go ahead, Madam Director.
Thank you, through you, Chair. My comment is less about the definition of undue hardship and more around the comment around denial of full accommodation, because we also need to have an understanding about the parameters around an accommodation. And sometimes while it is that the accommodation that is sought is not the accommodation that is provided, it doesn't mean that accommodation has not met the need. So I think, for example, that there are times when the identified accommodation is what is preferred by the individual as opposed to the accommodation we can supply that meets the judged need, etc. So I do I do question that piece around the piece around the fully accommodated, and I guess I'm trying to understand. I think that what you are suggesting is the implementation of a recommended accommodation based on an HREA resolution, because we have scenarios where an accommodation is sought through other avenues, but it doesn't come through the HREA office. So are we talking about every scenario where accommodations are sought and denied, redirected, or provided in a different way in the system, or only through this mechanism here?
I'd be happy to respond, Mr. Chair, or I could wait.
I'm going to turn it over to Trustee Blackburn if she has any comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I mean, I was going to the director for her comments about this, and I share the same concern she does as who gets to define what the accommodation is, and who gets to define whether it was denied. So I'll listen to the debate, but I can't see that I'll support this.
Thank you. And seeing no further comments or questions, back to Trustee Campbell for answering the questions and wrap up.
Okay. I'll try. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we could alter the words full, be satisfactory. I'm not suggesting by any means there couldn't be satisfactory replacement mitigations or accommodations. Staff are already going to be determining what constitutes undue hardship. This is only where claims of undue hardship are brought to bear, right? It's not in all other cases. So I mean, staff are already doing some interpretation. It would be up to staff, for instance, to say, no, this accommodation we believe is fully satisfactory. There's no need to assert undue hardship. So, right, this is only where undue hardship is asserted, right, and that a satisfactory plan can't be put in place. So, as I say, this may not come up that frequently, but I think it is important for the board to know. Though I'd like to look at a general reporting obligation, I think it would be out of place to put that in a human rights policy. The general scope of the obligation here, as I saw it, would be with respect to recommendations from the OHREA. And the way that staff dealt with that. There are clauses here, staff will know better than I do, where basically it makes clear the OHREA is to make recommendations to staff. It's up to staff to decide what to do with them, and that accommodations should be made to the point of undue hardship. So at the end of the day, this is basically it goes to the interaction reporting on a particular kind of outcome. It's really just undue hardship. So it's really just suggesting that under the reporting obligation, we're very clear and not leaving up the procedure that we do expect reports of the rationale and general incident rates of which may be fully supported. I'm not and not necessarily looking at individual cases, but where the undue hardship provision basically clause is exercised, I believe the Board of Trustees needs to know that. Thank you.
Okay, with that and with that wrap up, I'd like to call the question on this amendment. All those in favor?
Campbell in favor.
Lyra in favor.
Wallace in favor.
Bell in favor.
And opposed?
George opposed.
Off opposed.
Scott opposed.
Jenkins
Blackburn opposed.
Any opposed? And I believe that is defeated, Trustee Campbell. And I think you do have just a little bit more time left.
Well, I might be able to fit in my last question, not leading to amendment, at least at this time, and that's just exploring a little bit further the interaction I brought up the last meeting with respect to the scope of jurisdiction, as it were, of this policy with respect to third-party service providers and permit holders. And as I understood the discussion, two suggestions were made, which are slightly different. And I think the nuance is different and is important. And I think I just like clarification of the staff view in this. One of my understandings from some of what was said was that we would only, in a sense, pursue matters with respect to service providers or permit holders if I know I'm over time. I'll just set this out very quickly. If one of our students was implicated, but then there was another suggestion I understood that potentially, notwithstanding whether a student was affected, for instance, if a permit holder had human rights violating agendas or something else is going on, that we may have recourse as well. That discussion was indistinct to me, and I just like to understand better from staff how they view that.
Thank you, Trustee Campbell. HREA Tanner?
Through you, Madam Director, I think that it might be better to have the person responsible for contracts address this. From my perspective, when we contract with someone to deliver services or to engage as a third party, we will hold them to our standards of conduct while they were within the OCDSB environment. So those standards of conduct include refraining from discriminating or harassing someone on protected grounds. So I think that last week when we discussed this, Superintendent McCoy and CFO Carson sort of talked about including some of those obligations potentially into existing contracts to ensure that that obligation is clear. And I think that is the intention of this policy, to ensure that anyone who is within the OCDSB environment only, because that's where the policy applies, must conform with what the requirements are and our expectations are under the policy. Now, the broader implications of whether or not that applies to actions outside of the OCDSB environment that may impact on the OCDSB environment, I'm not sure of. So if there's someone on staff who may have a better or stronger answer on that, I would be happy to learn as well. Thank you.
So CFO Carson is not with us this evening, but I think that I would concur with Ms. Tanner's representation of what happens when it is that we do have contractors who are working with us and do have impact on our staff, our students, and our situation within the OCDSB. I would be unclear as to what kind of situation would cause us to take action beyond the OCDSB, simply because we simply would refrain from engagement. When we think about there's a contract piece, but there's also the community use of schools piece, where it is we have people who may engage. But again, if it's engaging in alignment with our policies and our procedures, and this in fact is in alignment with the values of the organization. So if there were, for example, an organization that was renting one of our facilities, so their own people are coming and they're doing whatever they're doing, but we come to learn that they're using one of our facilities in the interest of something that is misaligned with our human rights policy, then we certainly would be putting into question. Now, that said, we also have to be cautious about how it is we're interpreting certain community use partners, for example, where some of their practices may be a part of, I'm thinking, for example, community groups where they may have certain practices around, dividing, make gendered identity situations where we may have those kinds of difference. And so there is a conversation about when it is that we have conflicting, I don't know if that's the right word, but priorities around prohibited grounds, if you will, then we would have to be enacting a whole different protocol around determining how it is that we would be responding there. But I would say to you that on a general basis, if we had people that are working for us, contracted to us, and they're not adhering to our expected practice, we would simply not be engaging with them any further. That is our recourse.
All very helpful.
Thank you. And with that, we have, by the bylaws of this organization, I do have to call the 10:30 vote. And we need...
Mr. Chair, can I just ask a question?
Yes.
I'm presuming that we are not going to be able to get to the next item this evening.
Yes.
So
I think...
can I move? Sorry, I'm just going to put my camera on. Can I move that we move the rest of the meeting, that we finish off this item this evening, if trustees indulge?
Chair, I believe I'm the next on the
10:30.
speakers list.
Yes, past 10:30 to finish this, but that we actually move continuance of the other item to a future meeting.
I do have to abide by the bylaws of the organization, which says I need to call the 10:30 vote.
All right.
Okay. After that, if we choose to end the meeting, then I think that in indulgence to the rest of the members, we might consider how we can conclude the items that are remaining. We still have a motion on the floor and we have another item. So I think that we'll do that. So we need 8 members to continue. And so all those in favor of continuing the meeting past 10:30, and I'm going to have to record this. So please say it clearly. Thank you.
Campbell in favor.
Lyra in favor.
Paul's in favor.
Scott in favor.
Bell in favor.
Words in favor.
All right, thank you very much. So we are continuing with our meeting. And I did have, actually, given the hour, I think that I'm going to ask Executive Officer Giroux with regards what could be done with the second item that we have. Do you have any ideas, Executive Officer?
Mr. Chair, on a point of order, I believe that Trustee Ellis is the next speaker regardless. Following this, I don't know what he has to say, but I do think that we've taken our vote. We're continuing the meeting, and you should continue with the next speaker and then add in whatever it is you wish to do.
All right, very good. Trustee Ellis, go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to take a look at 2.22, people in positions of authority. I have some concerns that people are in position of authority only when they are working directly with students. This doesn't speak to people who are in authority over other employees. Could be, you know, parents. There's a whole lot of authority figures here and differences, and I'm just wondering why it's limited to students. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Trustee Ellis. So that's not the intention. So it could just be a problem with drafting, which we could try to clarify the intention. And I think I was hoping the commas got us there, but they might not have.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you. We're getting late. I'm not meaning to cut you off. I'll come back with an amendment on that if, for board. On 2.9, Creed. Do all of the conditions need to be met? Only one of the conditions need to be met, or a combination of the conditions need to be met to meet the threshold for it, for a belief being a creed? Right now it reads all of them have to be met.
And that is how it has been applied by OCDSB previously. This was taken from the religious creed and accommodation policy that currently exists at OCDSB. So when we were recommending rescinding that and replacing it with this, we moved the definition over. So yes, they all need to be met.
Okay, thank you. And I'll leave it at that, but I'll be coming back to board with stuff. Thanks.
Thank you. And I did have also Ms. Lamba on my list for the main motion.
I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I also had Trustee Blackburn on the list for the main. You're muted, Trustee Blackburn, unfortunately.
Good, Mr. Chair. I guess it appears we're going to talk about this another night. So if I have anything, I'll add it then.
I believe that Ms. Tanner has one additional point to make with regards to the 2.9, section 2.9.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Trustee Ellis, just to go back to the information I shared about Creed, what I failed to say is that's also the standard of the test that's put forward by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Those 5 elements are what we need to consider when we're establishing whether or not a Creed exists. So it's not just from the OCDSB policy, but it's actually reflective of the standard within the OHRC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And seeing no further speakers on the motions list, we're going to go back to Rob
Sure. A quick wrap up. I encourage everybody to pass this, or maybe the odd tweak or quibble at board. Hopefully it's relatively expedited then. Didn't get everything I wanted here, but I'm very happy overall with the product. I really commend staff for all of the work and all of the consultation that was done on this. It's a very important policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, concluding remarks, I'm going to call the question on this. All those in favor of the motion that is in e-scribe, I think it's A, B, and C.
Bell in favor.
Schwartz in favor.
Blackburn in favor.
Campbell in favor.
Boothby in
Lyra.
favor.
Jenkins in favor.
Scott in favor.
Any in favor? And opposed? And thank you very much. That passes.
What about abstentions, Chair?
Sorry, abstentions?
Ellis abstains.
Okay, thank you very much, Trustee Ellis. So we do have another item, and since we're continuing the meeting, we can probably get at least some discussion on it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the director.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I did notice that Trustee Lara had put her hand up. I don't know if it was something before we introduced this, or if you would like me to go ahead.
Go ahead, Trustee Lara.
I was going to move that we defer this item to a later point in time. It's quite late, and I don't think we're going to get anything meaningful done before the 11 o'clock vote. And I have a sneaking suspicion this meeting will not continue past 11. I would hate for us to get introduced to this item only to have it basically reintroduced the next time we come forward with this. So I'm going to move that we defer this to agenda planning, refer this to agenda planning to determine when this meeting should come back.
All right. Sorry, go ahead, Madam Director.
Through you, Chair, before that step might be taken, I do believe that Executive Officer had a suggestion that may be contemplated by trustees pertaining to the next item. Executive Officer, do you care to bring your suggestion forward at this time?
Sure. The next item is a discussion item only. It has appeared on the last couple of agendas. But it was at SEAC. It's been received by SEAC. It didn't have any real discussion at SEAC. And so was going to suggest that this may be an item that trustees could provide their comments or questions to the superintendent in writing. And we haven't, to the best of my knowledge, received any questions in advance on this. And the superintendent can respond individually. And if there's sufficient questions, I can share all of those responses by memo.
So that's a suggestion from Executive Officer Drew that we simply provide review the report and provide comments by written comments to Superintendent Simmons instead of discussing this. And we'll have a quick discussion over that, starting with Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, and thank you to the executive officer for the suggestion. I'm not opposed to that suggestion. I'm very concerned. We have our special education learning support services staff have sat through this entire meeting to get to this item, and we're not going to get to it. And so, and they've sat through other meetings. So the question, I guess, is if we don't go with this suggestion, how many more meetings are we going to ask these people to sit through where they don't get to present the material? Or are we going to make a commitment to actually get to this and then let other staff sit through meetings that because we don't get to their agenda items?
Thank you. And I think that that particular issue may have been resolved with the motion to refer it to the Agenda Planning Committee, but go ahead, Trustee Locke.
I am not in favor of kicking our reports out of the public eye. I think that the reports that we write and that we bring to board are important. And when we decided as a board to get rid of the second COW meeting every month, it has caused us to have a backlog of things that we need to discuss. If this is something that we want to continue to do, to only have one COW meeting, then we need to be willing to push things out of the public eye. And I don't think that's the direction we should go. I think that if we, as a district, are committed to public accountability, we should be holding 2 COW meetings every month, and it would stop these kinds of things from piling up and backing up. And so I don't support pushing things out of the public eye. I think that they deserve to be discussed in public. This is a discussion item. We should be discussing it. And so, and I don't want to have this conversation at 10:45 because it's not the time and nobody's going to want to get into this. But I think we need to bring back the regular second COW meeting so that we can adequately plan for all the things we have to talk about. I don't support pushing this out of public. I think we should defer it and come back to it at another meeting. And if that means scheduling more meetings, so be it.
Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If questions are raised to Superintendent Simmons on this report, and a memo is forthcoming with a summary of the questions that were raised and the answers to those questions, that memo would be public, so it would not be hiding anything from the public at all. I think it's really important for trustees to consider time management issues in terms of the nature of the items that we are discussing and how much time we choose to use, in presenting our amendments. We often stray beyond what is strictly speaking on topic. And I think that we could do a better job of that in terms of whether or not there can be an additional committee of the whole meeting. We are still seeing significant amounts of additional staff work and effort that is required, and also dealing with staff absences due to COVID and having to isolate and so on. It is not just a simple thing of we push a switch and all of a sudden we've magically got 2 committee of the whole meetings back. It certainly is something that will continue to be under discussion at agenda planning and between myself and the director.
Doctor? Actually,
Chair, I would just like to point out that this was a second COW meeting and we still didn't get through our agenda. We could add, so that's one point. I'm really concerned that there's a lack, in my personal opinion, of appreciation for the fact that our senior staff.
Chair, I object. Chair, I object to her saying that we don't appreciate our senior staff.
I said in my
Trustee
opinion,
Blackburn has accused her fellow trustees of not caring for senior staff time and time again. I'm tired of that. Thank you.
So,
may I continue, Mr. Chair?
yes, just try to just be sensitive to what Trustee Ellis is saying, Trustee Blackburn.
Yes, I appreciate that, Chair Penny. I would also appreciate not being cut off every time I speak. I think I specifically said I was expressing my personal opinion. Am I allowed to express a personal opinion?
That's just being disingenuous.
Okay,
Trustee
Ellis.
Yeah,
Trustee
that's
Ellis.
fine. I'm leaving. I'm not putting up with this crap anymore.
Seriously.
Please continue, Trustee Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a democratically elected official, I believe I'm allowed to express my personal opinion based on my experience of 11 years on this board. We are in the middle of a pandemic. It is my personal opinion that there's not a complete appreciation on the part of some of what immense pressure our director, our associate director, and the senior staff, and everybody who is employed at the OCDSB. These meetings, these public meetings are not just organized in 5 minutes. A lot of work goes into this. Where do we want the energy being put? Does the public really want all the energy being put into these meetings? Or does the public want the energy primarily put into making sure that our schools are running the very best they can under very, very difficult circumstances? That is my question. And Mr. Chair, I appreciate you allowing me to express my opinion in a public meeting as an elected official. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Schwartz.
I just want to support and echo what Trustee Blackburn said. I think it's important that certainly at this late hour, we do recognize that this was an additional continuance meeting because we didn't get to this agenda item. This has been an ongoing issue from last year as well. I think we do need to be mindful of our staff's mental well-being, and asking them to sit through hours of meetings is not conducive to anyone's well-being. I would also echo Trustee Blackburn's view that we need to ensure that we're focused on our staff time, on students' well-being and school safety. That is paramount during a pandemic. And so I would not be in favor of adding in additional committee of the whole meetings. I do ask that my fellow colleagues do be mindful of the time that they're taking on items, and that we actually try and get through an agenda more efficiently than we have been doing as of late. We have a lot of important business to deal with, but I would, again, ditto for me for everything that that Trustee Blackburn said. So I appreciate her stating what she did.
And thank you very much, Trustee Schwartz. And if we could just quickly limit our comments, we're trying to have a quick discussion, deciding what to do with the second item. So I appreciate your comments about the second COW meeting and stuff like this, but.
Sorry, I meant to,
Oh, that's okay, that's okay.
Because it's late, what I meant to actually say was, I would be in favor of the approach that Trustee Scott recommended. I think as we do with the budget committee, many of our questions are asked in a written way, and they're responded to in a written way. We don't have everything out in the public in terms of debate, and therefore I would agree that I think we could proceed in this fashion for a number of our reports. In fact, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Campbell.
Thank you, for first of all, I guess I'm not averse to the idea of making this effectively an information item, which, you know, questions can be asked offline or what have you. And I wonder if it really needed to come forward for discussion per se. And I guess I'm personally okay with that prospect in this case. If I may, because several speakers have spoken against the idea of a second COW, may I just be permitted half a minute to offer a differing perspective for balance. That is, we used to have 2 boards and 2 committees of the whole. After having got rid of all of our standing committees, then we went down to 2 cows and 1 board, and now we're down to 1 cow and 1 board. And we're expected somehow to wisely listen to delegations and conduct all kinds of COVID-related business, and in addition, move along policies and all kinds of other business in an increasingly narrowing window. And I personally think it's embarrassing to see us take 15 minutes to half an hour, meeting after meeting after meeting, trying to figure out how to continue to a next meeting, which was inevitable and which we should have scheduled in. And I think we should just schedule them in. I think we need to look instead at how many staff are invited to these meetings. I don't know that we need 25 people on the line. I really do think while we have to be mindful of our time and respecting staff's time and our duty, we also have a duty to the public to make sure that we're passing well-crafted policy, that we're really considering budget items, that we're really listening to delegations. We have other duties and obligations as well. So I think that just needs to be stated. Thank you. And I look forward to a conversation at some point with my colleagues around this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Trustee Lyra.
So this item was kicked from a meeting in December when we didn't have 2 cows. And so if we're carrying items month over month that go that far back, it's because we didn't have time to address it. My understanding is we have a motion on the floor to defer this to committee of the whole, or to agenda planning to come back at a future committee of the whole. And so I think we should vote on that.
All right, agreed. So the motion is to refer the item to the committee of, to the agenda planning committee for future to decide how to how it's going to come back to committee of the whole. So all those, I'm going to call a question on that. All those in favor of the referral?
Trustee Lyra in favor.
And opposed?
Howell opposed.
Schwartz opposed.
Jennings opposed.
And abstaining?
Scott abstaining.
And so the motion to refer is defeated. And so being the chair of the committee of the whole, I don't have much leeway other than to say we either carry on till 11 and have it end, or we have it handled in the way that the executive officer suggested. So given that there's only 5 minutes till 11 o'clock vote, I would suggest that this is the way we handle it for now, that we have it as an item where trustees can provide written comments to the superintendent. Trustee Scott?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wish to have permission to correct a misstatement of fact by a previous speaker. The item in question in terms of this report on our specialized special education classes was not in fact on an agenda in December. It went to SEAC at the beginning of January and was scheduled only for our committee of the whole meeting, at which we did not get to the item and then came to this meeting, but it was never on an agenda for us in December.
My apologies.
Thank you. And so that's the direction we will take. If we receive, if Trustee Scott and myself receive an overwhelming number of emails from the rest of the trustees stating that they feel desperate that this must come to a future COW, we'll take that under consideration at our agenda planning meeting. So other than that, this concludes our 2 agenda items for this evening. So we are adjourned, and have a good evening, everyone.